Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving home late one night. The kind of rain coming down where your wipers can't keep up no matter how fast you set them. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional set of headlights in the distance. I'd been on the road for hours, tired but determined to make it home. The gas light came on, and I knew I couldn't push it much further. I saw a sign for a gas station, barely lit, and decided to pull off. It wasn't one of those chain places with bright lights and clean pumps. This was old and run down, with a single flickering bulb over the canopy and a small building off to the side. There was a single pump, and it looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The rain made it all look worse, streaking down the windows and pooling in uneven patches of the pavement. I parked under the canopy and stepped out, pulling my jacket tight against the rain. I didn't see anyone around, but the lights inside the small building were on, so I assumed someone was working. The pump didn't take cards, so I walked to the door to pay first. As soon as I opened it and stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the distinct sound of a lock clicking. The guy behind the counter was older, probably in his 60s, wearing a faded blue shirt with a name tag that read Frank. His face was pale, and his eyes darted around like he was expecting something bad to happen. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like I'd made a mistake coming in. I need to fill up, I said, trying to brush off the weird vibe. 20 on pump 1. He didn't move. He kept staring at me, then glanced out the window behind me. His hand was on something under the counter, and I started to feel uneasy. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" Frank's eyes flicked back to the window, then to me. "You shouldn't have stopped here." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I laughed nervously, thinking maybe he was joking, but his expression didn't change. He leaned forward a bit, lowering his voice even more. "There's someone out there," he said. "In the shadows. Watching." I turned to look, but the rain was coming down so hard that I couldn't see much past the faint glow of the canopy light. The edges of the station disappeared into darkness. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean much. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice louder than I meant it to be. Frank nodded. "They've been out there for a while. They don't come close, but they're there. Watching. Waiting." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It was late, raining, and I was out in the middle of nowhere. The idea that someone could be out there, hiding just beyond the light, made my skin crawl. I told myself he was probably just paranoid, maybe drunk or on something, but the way he was acting, calm but clearly scared, got to me. "I didn't see anyone," I said, trying to sound casual. "You wouldn't," he replied. "They stay just out of sight. They know how to avoid being seen." I started to feel trapped. The locked door behind me, the rain outside, and Frank's unsettling behavior were getting to me. I looked at him again, at his hand under the counter. I was pretty sure he was holding a weapon, and that realization didn't make me feel any safer. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm, "I just need gas. I'll fill up and get out of here, all right?" Frank shook his head. "I can't let you go back out there. Not yet. It's not safe." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. My heart was pounding now, and I started to feel like I'd walked into something I didn't understand. "I don't have time for this," I said, heading back toward the door. But when I reached for the lock, Frank spoke again, his voice sharper this time. They'll come for you if you go out there now. I froze, my hand still on the door. The rain pounded against the glass, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement outside, a shadow slipping past the edge of the light. My stomach dropped. Who are they? I asked, turning back to face him. Frank didn't answer. He just shook his head and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't make out. I looked out the window again, scanning the darkness, but I didn't see anything. Listen, I said, my voice shaking. I'm leaving. I don't know what's going on here, but I'm not staying. Frank stood up suddenly, and I took a step back. He held up his hand, palm out, like he was trying to calm me down. Fine, he said. Go if you want. But if you see them, don't stop. Don't talk to them. Just keep driving. I didn't say anything. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The rain hit me hard, soaking through my jacket almost instantly. I glanced around the lot, my eyes searching the shadows, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My hands were shaking as I hurried to the pump and started filling my tank. The rain was so loud I couldn't hear anything else, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out of the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every shape in the distance looked like a person. I tried to tell myself it was just Frank getting in my head, but I couldn't shake the fear. As I finished pumping, I thought I saw something, a figure, just beyond the edge of the canopy light. It was there for only a second, then gone. My chest tightened, and I fumbled with the nozzle, trying to get it back in place. I didn't even care about the change. I just wanted to get in my car and leave. I climbed in, locking the doors immediately. The rain was still pouring, and the windshield wipers barely made a difference. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Frank was standing in the doorway, watching me go. The road was dark, the trees on either side closing in. I kept my eyes on the road, but every few seconds, I checked the mirrors, convinced I'd see someone following me. For a while, there was nothing. Just the rain and the headlights cutting through the darkness. Then, in the distance, I saw them. Two figures standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, they didn't move. They just stood there, facing my car, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. When I looked in the mirror again, the figures were gone. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me the whole way home. It was late, probably just past midnight, and I was sitting at a nearly empty bus stop. The rain had stopped earlier, but everything still smelled damp. The street was quiet, just the occasional car passing by in the distance. The bus was running late, and I was already regretting staying out so late. The street light above me flickered now and then, but at least it stayed on. The only other person there was a man sitting a little further down the bench, slumped forward with his elbows on his knees. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He was muttering to himself, but a lot of people talk to themselves in public, especially late at night. I figured he was just waiting for the bus like me, maybe a little drunk or something. He wore a big jacket that looked too heavy for the weather, and his hair was a bit messy. I kept my eyes on my phone, scrolling through random stuff to pass the time, but I was very aware of him. The muttering started to get louder. It wasn't full sentences, just broken phrases, but it sounded angry. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, and he was rubbing his hands together, rocking a little. That's when he suddenly stopped and looked right at me. "You," he said, his voice sharp and low. You know something. I froze for a second, confused. Sorry? I said, trying to sound polite. You know about her, he said, leaning forward. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had this intensity about him that made my stomach knot. You've seen her, haven't you? My daughter. You've seen her. I shook my head quickly. No, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just waiting for the bus. He stood up, and that's when I started to feel real fear. He wasn't a big man, but there was something about the way he moved that made me feel trapped. He stepped closer, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Don't lie to me, he said, his voice rising. I've seen the way you're looking at me. You know where she is. I stood up, trying to create some space between us. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. I don't know anything about your daughter, I said, backing up a step. I'm just waiting for the bus, like you. He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. No, no, no. You're lying. You people always lie. He pointed a finger at me, his hand shaking. You know what they did to her. You were there. I didn't know what to say. The street was completely empty, and the nearest building was a closed convenience store with the lights off. I glanced down the road, hoping to see the bus, but there was nothing. I don't know anything, I said again, my voice shaking now. I think you have the wrong person. He took another step closer, and I backed up until I hit the edge of the bench. Don't walk away from me, he said, his voice sharp. You're going to tell me what I need to know. I looked around, trying to figure out my options. I thought about running, but the bus stop was in the middle of a long stretch of road with nowhere to go. My phone was in my hand, but I didn't want to provoke him by pulling it up to call someone. I'm telling you the truth, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know you, and I don't know your daughter. His face twisted, like he was trying to decide if he believed me or not. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. Of course, you'd say that, he muttered. They always say that. He turned away for a moment, pacing back and forth in front of me. I took a deep breath, trying to think of how to get out of this. Look, I said, keeping my tone calm, if your daughter is missing, you should talk to the police. Maybe they can help you find her. He whipped around to face me, his expression wild. The police? He spat. They don't care. They're in on it. All of them. They know what happened to her, and they're covering it up. Just like you. I didn't respond. I realized there was no reasoning with him. His eyes kept darting around, like he was expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. You're not going anywhere, he said suddenly, stepping closer again. He was so close now I could see the lines on his face, the way his hands trembled. Not until you tell me the truth. I felt trapped, my mind racing for a way out. My hands were shaking, but I gripped my phone tightly and took a step to the side, trying to put some distance between us. I don't want any trouble, I said. I'll leave, okay? You can wait for the bus here. He moved to block me, his body tense. You're not leaving, he said. Not until you tell me what you know. At that moment, I heard the faint sound of an engine. I turned my head quickly and saw headlights in the distance. The bus was finally coming. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. You think you're going to get away? He said, his voice dripping with suspicion. You think I'm just going to let you leave? I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the bus, willing it to get there faster. The man stepped even closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. As the bus pulled up, I moved quickly, stepping around him and heading for the door. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and I let out a yelp. "You're not leaving," he shouted, his voice cracking. The bus driver opened the door, and I shouted, "Help me." The driver, an older man with a no-nonsense look, stepped out immediately. "Hey," he barked, his voice loud and commanding. "Let her go." The man hesitated for a moment, then released my arm. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the driver stepped between us. "Get on the bus," the driver said, not taking his eyes off the man. I didn't need to be told twice. I climbed on, my hands still shaking as I found a seat near the front. The driver stayed outside for a moment, talking to the man, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Eventually, the driver got back on the bus and closed the door. He didn't say anything, just gave me a nod before starting the engine and pulling away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if the man was still there, watching as we drove off. All I could think about was getting home, locking my door, and never taking that late bus again. I had parked my car in this small lot just off a wooded trailhead. It wasn't a big hiking spot or anything, just one of those places locals used to get some quiet. It was late, maybe around 9 at night, and I'd stayed out a bit longer than I planned. I was heading back to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots, when I saw a car sitting at the far end of the lot. The car's headlights were off, but the engine was idling. It wasn't there when I parked earlier. I could see two people inside, but it was dark enough that I couldn't make out their faces. Something about it felt off right away. There weren't many cars out here, especially this late, and the nearest main road was a good 5 minutes away. I told myself they were probably just waiting for someone. Maybe a couple who had gone for a walk. I tried not to overthink it, but my pace slowed as I got closer to my car. The other car was positioned so that it faced the trail entrance, and I had to pass it to get to mine. As I got closer, the driver's window rolled down a few inches. "Hey," the driver called out. His voice was calm, casual. I stopped, trying not to seem startled. "Yeah. You just come off the trail?" he asked. I nodded, glancing at my car, which was only a few steps away. "Yeah, just heading out now." The passenger leaned forward, and I could see him a little better. He was younger than the driver, maybe mid-20s, with a hoodie pulled up over his head. The driver looked older, maybe mid-30s, clean-shaven, with a baseball cap. "Not many people out here this late," the driver said, like he was making conversation. "Yeah, it's quiet," I replied, keeping my answer short. "You come out here often?" the passenger asked, tilting his head slightly. I shook my head. "First time in a while." There was a pause, and I could feel both of them watching me. I stepped toward my car, reaching into my pocket for my keys. "You from around here?" the driver asked. His tone had shifted slightly, like he was sizing me up. "Not really," I said. "Just passing through." I reached my car and unlocked it, but before I could open the door, the passenger spoke again. "Where you headed?" he asked. That question froze me for a second. It was the way he said it, like he wasn't just curious, like he wanted to know something more specific. "Home," I said, keeping my voice steady. The driver chuckled softly, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Long drive?" I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out if they were just messing with me or if this was something more serious. I pulled open my car door and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. The driver leaned out of his window, his face still mostly in shadow. "We were just asking," he said. "No need to be rude." I didn't respond. I started the engine and glanced in my rearview mirror. The car behind me hadn't moved, but I could see their brake lights flicker on for a moment before going dark again. As I backed out of the parking spot, the driver's voice cut through the quiet. "Drive safe out there." It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it. Like it was a warning. I pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I checked my mirrors as I turned onto the narrow road leading back to the main highway. At first, I didn't see their car, but then, about a minute later, their headlights came on. They followed me. At first, I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence. Maybe they were just leaving too. But they stayed close, too close, their headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. The road was winding, with no streetlights, and the darkness made it hard to see much else. I drove at a steady speed, trying not to let them know I was nervous. After a few minutes, I saw a turnoff up ahead, a dirt road that led to another trailhead. I decided to take it, hoping they'd keep going. I turned onto the dirt road, my tires kicking up gravel. For a second, I thought it worked. Their car didn't turn right away. But then, as I glanced in my mirror, I saw their headlights swing around the corner. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't a coincidence. The dirt road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars, and it wound deeper into the woods. I didn't know where it ended, but I didn't have much choice. I sped up slightly, hoping to put some distance between us. The other car sped up too. I reached a point where the road opened up into a small clearing. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly, and threw it into reverse. I spun the wheel and backed up, aiming to turn around and head back to the main road. The other car stopped at the edge of the clearing, blocking the way out. I sat there, my heart pounding. Their headlights were blinding, making it impossible to see who was inside. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I shifted into drive and hit the gas, aiming for the narrow gap between their car and the edge of the clearing. My tires skidded on the loose gravel, but I managed to squeeze past them. As I sped back down the dirt road, I glanced in my mirror and saw their car turning around to follow me. I hit the main road and floored it, my car roaring as I pushed it as fast as it would go. The other car was right behind me, their headlights flashing now, like they were trying to mess with me. I knew I had to get to somewhere safe. The highway wasn't far, and I figured if I could make it there, I'd have a better chance of losing them. The next few minutes felt like hours. The road was dark and empty, and their car stayed right on my tail. I could see their silhouettes now, moving in the car, but I couldn't make out their faces. Finally, I saw the glow of the highway up ahead. I turned onto the ramp, my tires screeching as I merged onto the empty road. The other car followed, but they didn't stay long. After about a mile, they suddenly slowed down and turned off onto a side road. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I didn't see their car again that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been waiting for someone like me in that parking lot. I had been driving for hours and needed to stop for the night. The motel wasn't anything special, but it was right off the highway, and I couldn't keep my eyes open much longer. The rain had started about an hour before I pulled in, and by the time I parked, it was pouring so hard I had to run to the office with my jacket over my head. The clerk was an older man who barely looked up when I walked in. He handed me the key after I paid, muttered something about checkout being at 11, and went back to watching the tiny TV on the counter. I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. My room was around the back of the building, away from the road. The parking lot was empty except for my car, and the lights along the building barely worked, flickering in the downpour. My room smelled like damp carpet and cheap cleaning spray, but the bed looked clean enough, so I dropped my bag and sat down to take off my boots. The rain was loud against the window, almost drowning out the faint hum of the heater I turned on. I didn't bother with the TV. I just wanted to close my eyes and forget how much further I had to drive in the morning. I was about to lie down when I heard the knock. It was soft at first, so quiet I thought I imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the window. The curtains were drawn, and I couldn't see outside. My first thought was maybe the clerk had come to tell me something, but why would he knock on the window instead of the door? I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to decide if I should look. The knocking came again, steady and unhurried, like whoever was out there wasn't in a rush to leave. I finally moved toward the window, careful not to get too close. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek out, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing just outside the window, drenched from the rain. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and a hood pulled up over his head. He was staring straight at the window, but it didn't seem like he could see me through the gap in the curtains. He knocked again, harder this time, and then leaned in close, his face almost against the glass. "Hey," he called out. His voice was muffled, but I could hear him over the rain. "You in there? My car broke down. Can you help me?" Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. He wasn't shouting or panicked, just calm and steady, like he knew I was listening. I didn't answer. I let the curtain fall back into place and stepped away from the window, my heart pounding. The knocking came again, louder now, almost impatient. "Come on," he said. "I just need to use your phone. I won't take long." I glanced at the door, making sure it was locked. I didn't have a chain or deadbolt, just a basic knob lock, and suddenly it didn't feel like enough. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rain. I thought maybe he'd left, but then I heard him again, closer this time. He was at the door. "Hey," he called out, his voice lower now. "I know you're in there. I saw your car." I backed up toward the bathroom, my hands shaking. There was no peephole on the door, so I couldn't see him, but I could hear the handle jiggle slightly, like he was testing it. "You don't have to open the door," he said. "Just slide the phone out, and I'll be on my way." I didn't move. I didn't say anything. After a few seconds, the handle stopped moving, and the rain filled the silence again. I stayed where I was, barely breathing, waiting to see if he'd leave. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the building. He was circling back to the window. I crept toward the window and peeked out again, just enough to see him standing there, looking at the curtains. His hood had fallen back, and his hair was plastered to his head from the rain. He looked calm, like he had all the time in the world. He knocked on the glass again, leaning close. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. The operator answered, and I whispered into the phone, telling her where I was and what was happening. She told me to stay on the line and stay hidden, that she was sending someone. The man outside must have seen the light from my phone, because he stepped back suddenly, his face twisting into something harder, angrier. "What are you doing in there?" he shouted, slamming his hand against the glass. I didn't answer. The operator kept talking, telling me to stay calm, but her voice felt far away. All I could hear was him pounding on the window, harder and harder, like he was trying to break it. Then he stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I didn't move, didn't dare look out again. After what felt like forever, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the window. I thought maybe he'd finally given up, but then I heard something else, a car door slamming. I peeked out again, just in time to see headlights cutting through the rain as a car pulled out of the lot and disappeared down the highway. The police arrived a few minutes later. I told them everything, but there wasn't much they could do. The clerk hadn't seen anyone, and there were no cameras in the lot. They said it was probably some drifter, someone looking for a quick score or trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been waiting for someone like me, alone and out of options. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the room with the lights on, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things and left, promising myself I'd never stop at a place like that again. It was one of those nights when everything felt off. The rain was coming down hard, making the wipers work overtime, and the highway was mostly empty. I'd been driving for hours, and the storm wasn't letting up. My rig felt heavier than usual, though I knew it wasn't. It was just the weather and the way the road seemed to stretch forever. I spotted a truck stop up ahead, its neon sign flickering in the downpour. It wasn't a big place, just a small diner with a few pumps and a gravel lot for trucks. I decided to pull in and rest for a bit. My eyes were getting heavy, and the rain made the road harder to see. The lot was mostly empty, just a couple of rigs parked on the far side and one beat-up car near the diner. I parked toward the edge, giving myself some space. I liked to keep my distance from others when I could. It made it easier to sleep without worrying about someone messing with my trailer. I killed the engine, leaned back in my seat, and closed my eyes for a moment. The sound of rain on the roof was steady, almost soothing. I wasn't planning to sleep long, just enough to shake the fatigue. A set of headlights cut through the darkness, pulling into the lot. I glanced in my side mirror and saw a van, old and white with no markings, rolling in slowly. It stopped a few spaces away, its engine idling. I didn't think much of it at first. People come and go at truck stops all the time. But the van didn't park near the diner or the pumps. It just sat there, the headlights shining across the lot. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore it. Maybe they were waiting for someone or deciding whether to stop for gas. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I was tired, and I needed to focus on getting some rest. A few minutes passed, and the van still hadn't moved. I glanced in the mirror again and saw the driver's side door open. A man stepped out, pulling up the hood of his jacket to shield himself from the rain. He started walking toward my truck. I didn't like it. Something about the way he moved, too slow, too deliberate, put me on edge. He wasn't heading for the diner or the other rigs. He was coming straight for me. I locked my doors and sat up straighter, watching him through the side window. He stopped a few feet away, standing just outside the beam of my cab light. "Hey," he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the rain. "I need to talk to you." I cracked the window just enough to hear him better. "What's the problem?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "You stole something from me," he said, pointing at my rig. I frowned, my mind racing. I didn't know this guy, and I sure as hell hadn't taken anything from him. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. He took a step closer, his face partially hidden by the hood and shadows. "Don't play dumb. I saw your truck earlier, back at the rest area. You were parked next to me, and now my stuff's gone." I hadn't stopped at any rest area that night. The last time I pulled over was hours ago, and it was nowhere near this guy. "You've got the wrong truck," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I haven't been near you." He didn't back off. If anything, he seemed more agitated. Don't lie to me. I know it was you. You thought I wouldn't notice, but I did. The rain was still coming down, and I could see it dripping off his hood as he stood there, glaring up at me. Something about his eyes didn't sit right. They were too wide, too focused, like he was running on adrenaline or something worse. Look, I said, trying to keep calm, I don't know you, and I don't know what you're missing. You need to back off. He didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, and for a second, I thought he might pull out a weapon. My hand went to the handle of the tire iron I kept tucked under my seat. But he didn't pull out a gun or a knife. Instead, he held up a small black device, something electronic that I couldn't make out in the dark. You think I'm stupid? He said. You've been tracking me with this. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. What the hell are you talking about? This was in my van, he said, holding the device higher. You put it there. You've been following me, waiting for the right moment. I didn't know what to say. The guy was clearly unhinged, and I was starting to realize this wasn't about anything I'd done. He was paranoid, maybe high, and I just happened to be the unlucky target of his delusions. I don't even know who you are, I said firmly. You've got the wrong guy. He stepped closer, his free hand slapping the side of my door. Don't lie to me. I know it was you. I tightened my grip on the tire iron. You need to back off, now, I said, my voice low and steady. For a moment, he just stood there, rain dripping from his hood, his chest heaving like he was trying to decide what to do next. Then he turned and walked back toward the van, muttering to himself. I thought maybe he was giving up, but instead of getting back in the van, he opened the rear doors and started rummaging through something inside. I didn't wait to see what he was doing. I started the engine, ready to pull out of there. As soon as the truck roared to life, he turned around, his hands empty but his face twisted in anger. You're not getting away with this, he shouted, running toward the cab. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. I threw the rig into gear and pulled out of the lot, the tires kicking up gravel as I went. In my mirror, I saw him standing in the rain, watching me go. The van's headlights came on, and for a moment, I thought he was going to follow me. But he didn't move. He just stood there, the van idling behind him, until I lost sight of him in the rain. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the highway, my heart still racing. I don't know what that guy's deal was, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. Whatever he thought I'd done, he was too far gone to listen to reason. I reported it to the cops at the next stop, but they didn't seem too interested. They said it was probably just some guy tweaking out, looking for someone to blame for his problems. Maybe they were right. All I know is I'm going to be a lot more careful about where I stop from now on. You never know who might be watching. The station was almost completely empty that night, apart from the faint sound of the ticket machine humming and the distant rattle of wind against the overhang. I'd missed the earlier train by just a minute, so I had no choice but to wait for the last one. It was late, almost midnight, and the cold was creeping into my bones. The rain wasn't helping either. It was one of those steady, relentless rains that made everything feel heavier. I sat on the bench under the overhang, close enough to the tracks to hear the occasional drip of water from the edge of the shelter. The electronic board said the train was running 10 minutes late. I wasn't surprised, it always seemed to happen at this station. I adjusted my bag on my lap and tried to keep my focus on the platform, even though there wasn't much to look at. That's when I noticed him. At first, I thought he was just another passenger waiting for the same train. He was pacing back and forth on the far side of the platform, where the light didn't quite reach. His movements were jerky, like he couldn't decide which way to go. He'd take a few steps one way, stop, turn around, and pace back the other way. He didn't have an umbrella, and the rain was soaking through his clothes, but he didn't seem to care. His head was tilted slightly down, like he was talking to himself. I tried not to look directly at him, but it was hard to ignore him. The way he moved felt off. He wasn't in a hurry, but he wasn't relaxed either. It was like he had nowhere to be but couldn't stand still. I told myself he was probably just someone waiting, same as me. Maybe he was frustrated about the delay. People react differently to stress. I pulled out my phone and pretended to scroll through messages, though there wasn't much service out there. After a few minutes, I heard his footsteps getting closer. I didn't want to look up, but I could feel him moving toward me. The sound of his shoes on the wet concrete was louder now, slower, deliberate. He stopped a few feet away from the bench. "Waiting for the last one?" he asked. His voice was flat, neither friendly nor threatening, but it caught me off guard. I looked up, and he was staring at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, and his clothes clung to him, heavy with water. "Yes," I said, keeping my answer short. I hoped that would end the conversation, but it didn't. "You shouldn't wait," he said, tilting his head slightly. "It's not coming." I blinked, unsure how to respond. The board still said the train was delayed, not canceled. "It's late, but it'll come," I said, trying to sound confident, even though his tone unsettled me. He shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No, it never comes. Not this one." I shifted on the bench, gripping my bag tighter. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. "The last one," he said, his voice lowering. "It's not like the others. You don't want to get on it." I glanced around the platform, hoping to see someone else, anyone, but we were still alone. The lights flickered briefly, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the rain. "I think you're mistaken," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've taken the last train before." He laughed softly, but it wasn't a warm sound. It was dry and hollow. "Not this one," he said again, as if it was obvious. He moved to sit down on the bench, leaving just enough space between us that I couldn't get up without brushing past him. I thought about leaving, walking back to the ticket office, but the idea of being out there in the open felt worse somehow. At least under the overhang, I could see him. Out there, I wouldn't know if he was following me. "You don't believe me," he said, watching me carefully. "That's fine. Most don't." I didn't answer. I just stared at the electronic board, willing it to update, to tell me the train was finally approaching. But it stayed the same. "I used to wait, too," he said after a moment. "Back before I understood." "Understood what?" I asked, despite myself. He leaned back, tilting his face up toward the rain. "That some trains aren't meant to take you anywhere you want to go." I wanted to tell him to leave me alone, but something in his voice stopped me. He sounded so sure, so certain. It was unsettling, like he wasn't just talking to me, he was warning me. The sound of a distant horn broke the tension, and I felt a surge of relief. The train was coming. I stood up, clutching my bag, but he didn't move. He just watched me with that same faint smile. "It's here," I said, more to myself than to him. He shook his head again. "You think it's here, but it's not." I ignored him and stepped closer to the edge of the platform. The train's headlights cut through the rain, and the horn sounded again, louder this time. I glanced back at the bench, but the man hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, staring at me. As the train pulled into the station, I felt a strange sense of unease. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see anyone inside. The doors hissed open, and I hesitated for a moment. "Don't," the man said softly behind me. "Just walk away." I turned to look at him, and for the first time, his expression changed. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was tense, almost pleading. I don't know why I listened. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, or maybe it was just instinct, but I took a step back from the train. The door stayed open, waiting, but I didn't move. After a moment, the doors closed, and the train started to pull away. I watched it disappear into the rain, and the platform was silent again. When I turned back to the bench, the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere on the platform or in the parking lot. It was like he'd vanished. I waited for the next train, and it came without any trouble. But I've never stopped thinking about that night, and I've never taken the last train again. I don't know what would have happened if I'd gotten on, but I don't want to find out. I got home later than usual that night. It had been a long shift, and the rain was coming down hard, the kind that makes it hard to see even with the windshield wipers on full speed. The driveway lights weren't on. I must have forgotten to set the timer, so everything was pitch black except for where my headlights cut through the rain. As I pulled in, the beam caught something at the edge of the driveway. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the rain or maybe someone walking by. But they weren't moving. They were standing still, half hidden by the overhanging tree branches. The second I noticed them, I felt something tighten in my chest. It wasn't just that someone was there. It was how still they were, like they were waiting. I parked the car but didn't turn it off. I left the headlights on, shining toward the figure. They didn't flinch, didn't react to the lights at all. I couldn't make out much. A tall frame, how it pulled low over their face. The rain was bouncing off their shoulders, and they were soaked through, but they stood like it didn't matter. I sat there for a moment, engine running, trying to decide what to do. My phone was in my bag on the passenger seat, but I didn't want to reach for it. I didn't want to take my eyes off them. Something about the way they were standing, half in the shadows, head slightly tilted, made it feel like if I looked away, they'd move closer. Finally, I rolled the window down just a crack. The rain came in immediately, cold and sharp. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to sound firm. My voice didn't carry far in the downpour. For a second, nothing happened. They didn't move or speak. Then they stepped forward, just enough that the headlights hit them more clearly. They were a man, I could tell that now, maybe in his 40s or 50s. His face was pale, and his hood barely covered the top of his head. His clothes looked worn, but I couldn't tell if they were dirty or just soaked. "You don't recognize me?" he said. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the rain. "No," I said. "Who are you?" He took another step closer, and I felt my hand tighten on the wheel. He wasn't close enough to touch the car, but he was too close for comfort. "We go way back," he said, smiling slightly. It wasn't a friendly smile. "You don't remember?" I shook my head, my heart starting to race. "No, I don't." "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, that faint smile still on his face. I thought about backing the car up, but the idea of reversing into the dark street behind me felt worse somehow. I wanted him to leave, to just turn around and walk away, but he stayed put. "You've got a nice place," he said after a moment, glancing toward the house. His tone was casual, like he was making conversation, but there was something off about it. Like he was testing me. "Look," I said, louder this time. "If you're lost or need help, you've got the wrong house. You should go." He tilted his head again, like he was thinking it over. Then he said, "You really don't remember me?" "No," I said firmly. "I don't." "Now leave." He finally took a step back, but instead of leaving, he started walking around the car, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped. I turned in my seat to keep him in view, but the rain made it hard to see clearly. He stopped near the rear passenger side, just out of the direct beam of the headlights. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" he asked. His voice was closer now, like he'd leaned toward the car, but I couldn't see him anymore. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm calling the police." I fumbled for my bag, keeping one eye on where I thought he was. My fingers found my phone, but when I looked back, he was standing in front of the car again. How had he moved so fast without making a sound? "You won't call," he said. He didn't sound angry, just certain. "You don't even know my name." I stared at him, my hand frozen over my phone. "Then tell me your name," I said. He smiled again, lighter this time. "What's the point?" "You wouldn't believe me." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I unlocked my phone, my hand shaking. "Leave," I said. "Now." For the first time, his smile faded. He stepped closer to the hood of the car, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. "You really don't remember," he said, almost to himself. Then he straightened up and added, "All right. I'll go." I didn't relax. Not yet. I watched as he turned and started walking toward the street, his pace unhurried. He reached the edge of the driveway and stopped, just for a moment, before continuing down the sidewalk and disappearing into the rain. I waited a long time before I turned off the car and got out. My hand stayed on the keys, ready to jump back in if I needed to. But he didn't come back. The street was empty, just the sound of rain hitting the pavement. I checked the house before I went inside. Every window, every lock. It all seemed untouched. Still, I didn't sleep that night. Every time the wind rattled the windows, I felt my chest tighten, half expecting to hear his voice again. I never saw him after that, but sometimes I wonder, how long had he been standing there before I noticed him? And why did he seem so sure I should know him? It was late when the rain started. I had just gotten settled in the cabin, trying to find something good on the old TV while the wind pushed against the windows. My friend, Tara, had offered me her place for the weekend, promising it would be peaceful, and I thought it would be. The cabin was small but cozy, tucked into a patch of woods about 30 minutes from town. The rain came in waves, heavier and louder until it drowned out the TV. I turned it off after a while and sat by the window instead, listening to the storm. There were no neighbors for miles, just trees and the dirt road leading to the highway. The quiet was nice. At least, it was until I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me, the wind carrying a noise that wasn't really there. But when I turned off the lamp and stood still by the window, I heard them again. It was faint but clear enough to tell it was two people. One was a man, low and gruff. The other was higher pitched, maybe a woman, though I couldn't be sure. The voices were coming from outside, not far from the cabin. I didn't move at first. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Kara hadn't mentioned anyone else being around. I stayed by the window, squinting into the dark, but I couldn't see much past the rain. There was no car, no flashlight, nothing to explain why two people would be out there in the middle of nowhere. The voices got louder. They weren't shouting, but they were talking fast, almost like they were arguing. I moved closer to the blinds, careful not to make any noise. Peeking through the slats, I saw two figures standing near the tree line, just where the dirt road curved out of sight. The man was tall, wearing something dark that hung loose around his shoulders. The other figure was smaller, maybe a woman, though it was hard to tell through the rain. She was standing with her arms crossed, her posture stiff. They were facing each other, but they weren't close enough to touch. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could tell it wasn't a friendly conversation. The man's gestures were sharp, pointing toward the road, then back toward her. She shook her head, stepping back slightly, but she didn't leave. I felt my stomach knot up. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't my business, but I couldn't just ignore it either. What if she was in trouble? But then, what if I opened the door and made things worse? I stepped back from the window, trying to think. My phone was on the kitchen counter. I could call someone, but who? The cabin barely had a signal, and I wasn't even sure where I was exactly. Kara had said the address wasn't listed on GPS. When I looked back out, they were still there. The man was pacing now, back and forth in the mud, while the woman stayed rooted in place. Her arms were hanging at her sides now, and I could see she was holding something, though I couldn't make out what it was. I decided to wait. Maybe they'd leave on their own. I turned off the porch light earlier, and the cabin was dark enough that they wouldn't know anyone was inside. I thought if I just stayed quiet, they'd move on. But they didn't. The man stopped pacing and turned toward the cabin. My breath caught. He didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, like he was looking for something. Then he said something to the woman and pointed again, this time toward me. She didn't turn, but I saw her shoulders tense. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding. There was no way they could have seen me. I was sure of it. The blinds had barely moved, and the storm was too loud for them to hear anything from inside. But then the voices stopped. I froze, listening. The rain was still coming down hard, but the arguing had stopped completely. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear something. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps in the mud. They were coming closer. I grabbed my phone and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I tried to pull up the emergency dial, but the signal was gone. I stared at the no service icon, willing it to change, but it didn't. Then I heard a soft knock on the front door. It wasn't loud, just 3 slow taps. I stayed in the bathroom, gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. The knocking came again, harder this time. Then the man's voice, low and steady. "Hello," he called. "Is someone in there?" I didn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin didn't have a back door, just the front and a couple of windows that opened into the woods. I could hear him shifting on the porch, the wood creaking under his weight. "We saw the light earlier," he said. "We know you're in there." I bit down on my lip, trying to stay calm. He was lying. The light had been off for hours. He was just trying to scare me. Then I heard the woman's voice, closer now. "We just need some help," she said. "Please." Her tone was softer, almost pleading, but something about it felt wrong. It didn't match the way she'd been standing out there earlier. I didn't trust it. The doorknob rattled, and I felt my stomach drop. "We just need to come in for a minute, the man said. "It's pouring out here." I stayed silent. The rattling stopped, but then there was a loud bang, like he'd kicked the door. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might stop. Then everything went quiet again. I stayed in the bathroom, barely breathing, until I couldn't hear anything but the rain. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, they were gone. The driveway and the road were empty, just with tire tracks leading back toward the highway. I didn't sleep that night. When the rain let up in the morning, I packed my things and left without looking back. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I haven't gone back to the cabin since. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and I was walking back to my dorm. The rain had started earlier in the evening, light at first but steady now. I hadn't thought to bring an umbrella because I wasn't planning to be out for long, but I'd gotten caught up at the library. The campus was almost empty, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel louder than it should be. My shoes slapped against the wet pavement, and the rain dripped off my hood, running down my face. I kept my head low, focused on the path ahead. The buildings around me were dark except for a few security lights glowing in the distance. It was the kind of night where you felt like you were the only person alive. But then I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first, somewhere behind me. I slowed down without thinking, trying to figure out if I'd imagined it. The sound stopped too. I waited, staring back down the path, but there was no one there. Just the rain and the empty walkway stretching into the shadows. I shook it off and kept going. Maybe it was an echo. The campus was full of weird acoustics, sound bounced off the buildings in ways that didn't make sense sometimes. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't stop listening for it. A minute later, the footsteps came back. They were heavier this time, splashing in the puddles behind me. I stopped walking again, my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped too, perfectly in time with me. I turned around, scanning the path. The rain made it hard to see far, but the walkway was empty. I didn't even see a shadow moving. My heart was starting to race now, a nervous energy crawling up my spine. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was probably just someone else heading home. But something felt off about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like eyes were on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I started walking faster, not running but close to it. The rain seemed louder now, the rhythm of it pounding against my hood, drowning out everything else. But the footsteps came again, louder, closer this time. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't want to. I cut across the grass, heading toward the dorms. My shoes slipped on the wet ground, and I almost fell, but I kept moving. The sound of footsteps followed me, still keeping that same rhythm, stopping whenever I slowed. When I finally reached the dorm courtyard, I felt a wave of relief. The lights were on, and there was a faint hum from the vending machines near the entrance. It felt safer, less exposed. I stopped under the overhang to catch my breath and listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the rain and the buzz of the lights. I turned toward the building, fumbling in my pocket for my key card. That's when I heard a voice. "You shouldn't walk alone at night." I spun around so fast I almost lost my balance. A man was standing at the edge of the courtyard, half hidden by the shadows of the building behind him. He wasn't tall, maybe average height, but his shoulders were broad, and he was wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was staring right at me. "I've been watching out for you," he said, taking a step closer. I didn't say anything at first. My mouth felt dry, and my heart was hammering in my chest. He took another step forward, slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to scare me off. His hands were in his pockets, but I couldn't tell if he was holding anything. "You looked like you were in a hurry," he said, his tone calm but strange, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. "Thought I'd make sure you got back safe." I tried to think of what to say, but nothing came out. My mind was racing. I didn't know who this guy was or why he'd been following me, but everything about him felt wrong. I took a step back toward the dorm entrance, keeping my eyes on him. "I don't need any help," I finally managed to say. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. He tilted his head, like he didn't believe me. "It's not safe out here. You never know who might be hanging around." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I gripped my keycard tighter, glancing toward the door. It was only a few steps away, but he was close enough now that I wasn't sure I could make it without him trying something. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going inside now." He didn't move for a moment, just stood there watching me. Then he smiled, or at least I think he did. It was hard to tell with the rain and the shadows. "You should be more careful," he said, his tone colder now. "Not everyone's as nice as me." That was it. I turned and swiped my keycard, shoving the door open with more force than I meant to. The lock clicked behind me as I stepped inside, and I pressed my back against the door, breathing hard. Through the glass, I could see him standing there, still watching me. He didn't move, didn't try to follow me, just stood there in the rain, staring. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked back the way he'd come, disappearing into the shadows. I stayed by the door for a long time, waiting to see if he'd come back. He didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't far away. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those footsteps, the way they stopped whenever I did. The next day, I told campus security, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. I don't walk alone at night anymore. Even in the rain, even when the campus feels empty, I always make sure someone knows where I am. Because I can't stop thinking about that man, about what he might have done if I hadn't made it inside. It was one of those nights where everything just felt off. I was driving through the storm, the rain so heavy I could barely see through the windshield. The wipers were going as fast as they could, but it didn't seem to make a difference. My headlights barely cut through the darkness of the empty road, and the only sounds were the constant roar of the rain and the tires skimming across the wet asphalt. I had been driving for hours and was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. The next town was a bit of a stretch, so I pulled into the first diner I saw. It was one of those old places with neon signs that flickered on and off. The kind of diner that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but I wasn't picky. At that point, I just needed a hot cup of coffee and a break from the rain. The bell on the door chimed when I walked in, and the warm air hit me almost immediately, making me feel a little less cold and damp. The diner was mostly empty except for a few scattered people at the counter and a man sitting alone in the corner booth. I didn't think much of him at first. He was just another person trying to get out of the storm, same as me. But something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I could feel his eyes on me the moment I stepped in. Not in the way people might glance over at someone new, but in a way that felt deliberate, heavy. It was like he was staring through me, not just at me. I tried to brush it off and went to the counter, sat down, and ordered a coffee. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s, was nice enough. She didn't ask too many questions, just handed me a menu and let me get on with it. I tried to focus on the cup in front of me, hoping the caffeine would help clear my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked up, that man in the booth was still staring at me, not moving, not looking away. His eyes never left me. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying not to make it obvious that I was avoiding his gaze. He didn't look dangerous, not exactly, but something about him felt off. He was dressed in dark clothes, his hair slicked back, and he had a scruffy beard. His face wasn't anything remarkable, but the way he stared at me made my stomach tighten. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, but I couldn't stop glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. I paid the bill and stood up to leave. As I reached the door, I turned back for a second and saw him still sitting there, still looking at me. That's when the first real shiver ran down my spine. There was something in his eyes now, something colder, more intent. But I shook it off and stepped outside into the rain, thinking I had just been imagining things. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. They were heavy, deliberate. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The diner door had just closed behind me, and I couldn't see anyone coming. I froze for a second, straining to hear anything else, but the only sound was the rain pouring down. I felt silly for being nervous and told myself it was just a storm, that I was on edge. But I had a bad feeling in my gut. I picked up the pace, heading to my car, my eyes darting over my shoulder every few steps. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer. I turned around just as the man emerged from the shadows, walking swiftly toward me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw that he was holding something in his hand. At first, I thought it was a tool, maybe some kind of pipe or a stick, but as he stepped into the light, I saw that it was a knife. I froze, my brain scrambling to process what was happening. The knife wasn't huge, but it was enough. I could see the blade gleaming in the light, and I could feel the weight of it in the air between us. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaky, but I had to say something. I was trying to keep it together, but I could feel the panic building. He didn't answer at first. He just kept walking toward me, slow but steady. The look on his face was blank, almost detached. There was no sign of urgency or fear, just that same cold stare he had inside the diner. I started to back up, moving toward my car, trying to think, trying to figure out what I could do. "I saw you in there," he finally said, his voice low, almost as if he was talking to himself. "I saw you look at me. I saw the way you looked away." I kept backing up, my breath coming faster now. I reached for my keys in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so much I had trouble finding them. I needed to get in my car, needed to lock the door, but I couldn't seem to move fast enough. The rain was coming down harder, and I could barely see through it, but I could hear him getting closer, each step sounding louder than the last. "I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice still calm. "But now you've seen me." My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I could barely think. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I knew I had to get away from him. I was almost to the driver's side of my car when I heard him speak again. "Don't run." It was quiet, but sharp enough to send a chill through me. I felt my legs freeze in place. I don't know why, but I did what he said. My hand was still fumbling for the keys when I heard the sound of his footsteps stop just behind me. For a second, all I could hear was the sound of the rain. Then I felt his breath on my neck. "Get in the car," he said, his voice cold now. "You don't want to make this worse." I didn't wait another second. I finally found my keys and yanked open the door, scrambling into the driver's seat. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could barely get the door closed. I locked it just as he reached for the handle, his fingers brushing against the window. I slammed the car into reverse, tearing out of the parking lot and away from him. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I couldn't tell you how I got there, but I know I didn't want to be anywhere near that diner or that man. My hands were shaking the whole way. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My mind kept replaying the look on his face, the knife in his hand, the way he had followed me out into the rain. I never went back to that diner. And to this day, I still get nervous when I have to stop anywhere alone at night, even if it's just for gas. I don't know what that man wanted or what would have happened if I hadn't gotten in my car, but I never planned to find out. I used to take the late bus home after work. It was one of those nearly empty rides where the only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the brakes. I liked the quiet, even if the dark streets passing by made everything feel a bit lifeless. That night, though, I didn't enjoy it. That night, I wished I had taken a different way home. It started when I got on the bus. There were only a few other people, a guy near the back hunched over, fiddling with something in his lap, a woman with headphones on staring at her phone, and another person I noticed right away. He was sitting across the aisle from me, a few rows up. I don't know why I noticed him first, but I did. Maybe it was because he wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, stiff and still, staring straight ahead like he was in a daze. I didn't think much of it at first. People act weird sometimes, especially on public transport. I picked a seat closer to the front, about halfway down the aisle, and settled in for the ride. I put my bag on my lap and stared out the window, watching the dark buildings blur past. But I could feel it after a few minutes, the kind of feeling you get when someone's eyes are on you. I glanced to my right, and sure enough, the guy was looking right at me. Not just looking, staring. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he was trying to burn a hole through me. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. I looked away quickly, pretending I hadn't noticed, but my stomach twisted. There was something about the way he was looking at me that didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I sat there, the harder it got. I could feel his stare, heavy and constant, and when I glanced over again, he was still at it. He hadn't moved. His head was slightly tilted now, and his mouth was moving. At first, I thought he might be talking to himself, but as I strained to hear, I realized he wasn't mumbling nonsense. He was saying something over and over, quietly, under his breath. It was my address. I froze. At first, I thought I must have misheard him. There was no way he could know where I lived. But then he said it again, clear enough that I couldn't mistake it. My street name, my building number, even the apartment number. He repeated it like a chant, his eyes never leaving mine. My chest felt tight, and my hands started to shake. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he had seen my address on something I was carrying. I checked my bag, making sure nothing had fallen out, but everything was zipped up. There was no way he could have seen it. I wanted to move, to get up and sit closer to the driver, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The guy in the back was still hunched over, and the woman with headphones didn't seem to notice anything. It was like the bus had gone silent, like it was just me and him. I could feel sweat forming on the back of my neck as I stared out the window, pretending I couldn't hear him, pretending I didn't notice the way he was leaning slightly into the aisle, getting closer. The bus stopped to let someone off, and I thought about leaving too, but I was still far from home, and the area we were in wasn't exactly safe. I stayed in my seat, gripping my bag tighter, trying to think of what to do. The guy didn't move, but he kept muttering. Every now and then, he'd pause, like he was waiting for me to react, then start again, his voice low and steady. When the bus pulled away from the stop, he stood up. My heart jumped into my throat. He didn't walk toward me, though. Instead, he moved to the seat directly across the aisle from mine and sat down, still staring, still muttering. He was close enough now that I could see the dirt under his nails, the way his hands twitched slightly as he gripped the edge of the seat. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have gotten on this bus," he said. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but the way he said it made my blood run cold. I glanced toward the front of the bus, hoping the driver might notice something was wrong, but he was focused on the road. The other passengers were still in their own worlds, oblivious. I felt trapped. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to sit still, to act like I wasn't afraid, even though I could barely breathe. The man leaned closer, his face inches from mine now. His breath smelled sour, like he hadn't eaten or brushed his teeth in days. "I know where you're going," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll see you there." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, clutching my bag, and moved toward the front of the bus. I didn't care if it made me look scared. I needed to get away from him. I sat in the seat closest to the driver, my back to the windshield, and kept my eyes on the man. He didn't follow me. He just sat there, staring at me from across the aisle, a small, crooked smile on his face. He stopped muttering my address, but I could see his lips moving, as if he was still saying it in his head. When the bus finally reached my stop, I hesitated. I didn't want to get off if he was going to follow me, but I couldn't stay on the bus forever. I waited until the last second, hoping he wouldn't move, then darted out the door as quickly as I could. I didn't look back, didn't check to see if he was getting off too. I just ran. I sprinted down the street toward my building, my heart pounding in my ears. When I reached the door, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped them twice. I finally managed to unlock the door and slammed it shut behind me, bolting it for good measure. I stood there in the dark for a long time, listening for any sound outside, any sign that he had followed me. But there was nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice whispering my address over and over again. I never took that bus again. In fact, I started driving to work after that, even though it was more expensive. It's been months, but I still check over my shoulder every time I leave my apartment, half expecting to see him standing there, smiling, waiting. It was a Thursday night, and the storm had rolled in quicker than expected. The library was quiet, the way it always was in the last hour before closing. I'd been putting away books, the kind of mindless task that makes the time drag, when I heard the first knock. It startled me because no one comes by that late. The library is in a small town, and most people don't bother when it's pouring like that. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice calling out. I couldn't make out the words at first, just that it was a man's voice. I hesitated, standing there with a book still in my hand. The storm had been bad, thunder rattling the windows and rain hitting the building like pebbles. It wasn't hard to imagine someone getting stuck outside. I walked toward the front door and saw him standing there, drenched, his hood pulled tight over his head. The glass was fogged up, so I could only see the shape of him at first. "Please," he said, his voice muffled but urgent. "I just need to get out of the rain." I almost didn't unlock the door. Something about it felt off. But then I thought about how awful it would be to be caught in a storm like that. The library was well lit and warm. He just needed a place to wait it out, I told myself. So I turned the lock and pulled the door open. He stepped inside quickly, shaking the rain off like a wet dog. His coat was heavy with water, and his boots squeaked against the floor. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, with dark, messy hair that stuck to his forehead. His face was sharp, angular, and pale from the cold. He looked normal enough, though his eyes were a little wide, darting around like he was checking the room for something. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and rough. He stood there dripping onto the carpet, not making any move to take his coat off or settle in. "It's bad out there." I nodded, staying a few feet away. "Yeah, it's been coming down all evening." "Are you all right?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment, his head tilting slightly. "You're the only one here?" It wasn't an unusual question. The library is small, and by that time of night, it's usually just me. But the way he asked it made my stomach tighten. There was something about the way he stared, unblinking, waiting for my answer. "Yeah," I said, forcing a small smile. "It's just me." We close soon, though. His expression didn't change. He looked past me, scanning the room again. "You sure?" I nodded, gripping the edge of the counter. "Yeah, it's just me." He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there in the middle of the room, water pooling around his boots. Then he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're lying." The words hit me like a slap. I froze, my brain scrambling to process what he just said. "Excuse me?" "You're lying," he said again, his voice sharper this time. He took another step closer, his boots squeaking against the floor. "Why would you lie about that?" I tried to laugh it off, though my hands were shaking. "I'm not lying. There's no one else here." But he didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He was staring at me like I was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. "Prove it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Prove you're not lying." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. How would I even prove that? Look around. The library's empty. He didn't look. He just stood there, staring at me, his chest rising and falling like he was trying to calm himself down. "I need to know," he said, his voice shaking now. "I need to know you're not lying." I took a step back, putting more distance between us. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "I'm not lying," I said again, my voice trembling. "Why would I lie?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, his eyes wide and wild, like he was trying to see through me. Then he moved, fast, heading toward the back of the library. My stomach dropped. "Hey!" I called after him, my voice cracking. "You can't go back there." I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just let him wander around, but I also didn't want to get too close to him. I followed at a distance, watching as he moved between the shelves, his head jerking from side to side like he was looking for something or someone. He muttered to himself under his breath, words I couldn't make out. When he reached the back corner, he stopped. He turned to look at me, his face twisted in frustration. "Where are they?" "Where's who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The others," he said, his tone sharp. "You said you're alone, but I know you're not." "Where are they?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking. "There's no one else here. Please, just calm down." But he didn't calm down. He started pacing, his hands running through his wet hair, muttering louder now. "It doesn't make sense," he said, almost to himself. "It doesn't make sense." I inched closer to the front of the library, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. My phone was on the counter, and I needed to call someone, anyone. But before I could reach it, he turned and saw me moving. "Stop," he yelled, his voice echoing through the empty library. "Don't move." I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. "I just need to know," he said, his voice breaking. "I just need to know you're not lying." "I'm not," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "I swear I'm not." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me like he was trying to decide if he believed me. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice calm now. "Okay." He turned and walked toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until he was outside and the door swung shut behind him. Then I locked it and called the police. When they arrived, he was gone. They didn't find him, and they couldn't explain how he knew I was there or why he thought I was lying. I still don't know what he wanted or what he might have done if I hadn't convinced him to leave. All I know is that I'll never stay late at the library again. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard the noise. It wasn't the usual hum of the cameras or the occasional groan of the old HVAC system. This was a sharp, loud banging. It echoed through the empty halls and sent a chill straight down my back. I was sitting in the security office, flipping through the monitors like I always did during the graveyard shift. Nothing on the screen showed anything unusual. Just a couple of parked cars outside and the flicker of fluorescent lights in the back corridor. Then it came again. 3 solid bangs, like someone was hitting metal. It sounded close, maybe outside near the loading dock. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it out. I told myself it was probably just the wind messing with the dumpsters. It had been raining for hours, the kind of rain that bounces off the pavement and turns every surface into a mirror. When I pushed open the back door, the cold hit me first, then the rain. My flashlight barely cut through the sheets of water coming down. I stepped out onto the loading dock, careful not to slip. The noise had stopped. Everything was quiet except for the rain hammering the metal awning overhead. Then I saw him. He was slumped against the side of the building, near the edge of the dock. At first, I thought he was just some guy who had too much to drink and wandered over here to get out of the rain. But as I got closer, I saw the blood. It was smeared on his shirt and dripping from his left arm. He looked up at me, his face pale and streaked with rainwater, and his eyes locked onto mine. "Help me," he said, his voice rough and shaky. I froze for a second, then forced myself to move. "What happened? Are you hurt?" He didn't answer right away. He was breathing hard, like it took effort just to sit there. I knelt down, trying to get a better look at his arm. There was a gash just below his shoulder, deep and ugly. "We need to get you inside," I said. "I can call for an ambulance." But as soon as I said that, his whole body tensed. "No," he snapped, his voice louder now. "No ambulance." I hesitated. The way he looked at me, wild-eyed and desperate, made my skin crawl. "You're bleeding pretty bad," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You need a doctor." "No ambulance," he said again, through gritted teeth. "You're not calling anyone." I stood up, backing off a step. Something wasn't right. He wasn't just hurt, he was scared. I could see it in the way his hands were shaking, in the way his eyes darted around like he was waiting for someone to jump out of the shadows. "Okay," I said, holding my hands up. "No ambulance. But I can't leave you out here. Come inside," and we'll figure something out." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I helped him up, and he winced but didn't say anything. He leaned on me as we made our way back into the building. His clothes were soaked through, and the blood was starting to drip onto the floor. Once we were inside, I sat him down on a chair near the security desk and grabbed the first aid kit from the wall. As I opened it, he spoke again. "Do you work here?" "Yeah," I said, pulling out some gauze. "I'm the night guard." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "You sure about that?" The question caught me off guard. "Yeah, I'm sure." "Why?" His eyes narrowed, and his hand twitched toward his pocket. For a second, I thought he might pull out a weapon, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring at me like he was trying to figure something out. "You were out there," he said quietly. "What?" "You were out there," he repeated, his voice rising. "I saw you." I froze, the gauze still in my hand. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said carefully. His face twisted into something angry and confused. "Don't lie to me." "I saw you." "You were with them." "With who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They followed me," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I got away, but they'll come." "You're with them, aren't you?" "You let them in here." I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "I'm just trying to help." He stood up, swaying a little, but his eyes were locked on mine. "You think I'm stupid?" he shouted. "You think I don't know what's going on?" "Calm down," I said, keeping my hands where he could see them. "You're hurt. You need to sit down." But he wasn't listening. He started pacing, muttering to himself, his hands clenching and unclenching. "They're coming," he said, almost to himself. "They're coming, and you let them in. You're one of them." "I didn't let anyone in," I said, my voice trembling now. "The building is locked. No one's here but us." He stopped and turned to face me, his eyes wide and wild. "Then prove it," he said. "Show me." "Show you what?" "That no one's here," he said. "Walk me through the building. Now." I didn't want to. Every instinct was telling me to get as far away from him as possible. But he was hurt and angry, and I didn't know what he might do if I refused. "Okay," I said. "I'll show you. But you need to calm down." He didn't answer, just gestured for me to move. I grabbed my flashlight and led the way, my hand shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. We walked through the empty halls, the sound of our footsteps echoing around us. Every so often, he would stop and look around, his head snapping toward any little sound. "There's no one here," I said, trying to sound calm. "It's just us." But he didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he kept looking over his shoulder. When we reached the last room, he stopped and turned to me. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. "Because you're hurt," I said. "That's all." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "If you're lying," he said, "you'll regret it." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, waiting for him to decide what to do. Finally, he turned and walked back toward the front of the building. "I'm leaving," he said. "Don't try to stop me." I didn't. I followed him to the door and watched as he stepped out into the rain. He didn't look back. When he was gone, I locked the door and called the police. They searched the area but didn't find him. I don't know who he was or what happened to him after that. All I know is that I still hear that banging sometimes, echoing in my head when the building gets too quiet. And every time it rains, I wonder if he's still out there, looking for someone to blame. It had been raining all day, the kind that made the air feel heavy and cold. By the time I got home from work, the streets were almost empty, just puddles reflecting the streetlights and cars parked in neat rows. My building looked the same as it always did: old brick, chipped paint around the windows, and that buzzing neon sign above the entrance that had been there since before I moved in. I ran from the cab to the door, my coat already soaked by the time I found my keys. The lobby lights were flickering, probably because of the storm. The elevator was out of service again. A piece of paper taped to the door had "out of order" written in red marker, the letters smudged from the humidity. It wasn't surprising, the elevator broke down every other month. I lived on the 4th floor, so I figured it wasn't worth waiting for it to get fixed. I could handle the stairs. The stairwell smelled like wet concrete and old smoke. Someone had left a pile of junk mail on the first step, and it stuck to my shoe as I climbed. The rain drummed against the narrow windows, loud enough to drown out the creaking of the old stairs. I was halfway up to the 2nd floor when I heard the sound of the main door opening below. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a big building. People came and went all the time. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy ones. Slow and deliberate. They didn't sound like someone in a rush to get out of the rain. They sounded like they were matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder. The stairwell was dim, with just one light bulb working on each landing. I couldn't see anyone yet, but the sound of those footsteps made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late, I was tired, and the storm wasn't helping my nerves. I kept walking, my hand gripping the railing tighter than it needed to. The footsteps got louder, closer. When I reached the 2nd floor, I stopped and turned around. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the stairs below, maybe 5 steps down. He had on a dark coat, rain dripping off his shoulders. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he wasn't carrying an umbrella. His face was blank, but his eyes were locked on mine. "Hi," he said, his voice low but clear. I nodded, not sure what else to do. "Hi." He didn't move, didn't explain himself. Just stood there, watching me. I felt my stomach twist, but I told myself maybe he was just another tenant. Maybe he lived here and was going to his apartment. Still, something about the way he was standing made me uneasy. Like he was too calm, too still. "Do you live here?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. It was an odd thing to ask, but I nodded again. "Yeah." "Alone?" he said, his head tilting slightly to the side. My chest tightened. The way he said it, so casual, made my throat dry. "Why?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just curious." I turned back toward the stairs and started walking again, faster this time. My heart was pounding, and I could hear his footsteps following me. He wasn't matching my pace anymore, he was speeding up. The sound of his boots hitting the stairs echoed through the narrow space, and it felt like it was getting closer with every step. I reached the 3rd floor and thought about going to someone else's apartment. I didn't know many of my neighbors, but I didn't want him to know where I lived. The problem was, I didn't want to stop moving either. Stopping felt like a bad idea. "Wait," he called out, his voice louder now. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I kept climbing, gripping the railing so tight my knuckles ached. I could hear him behind me, closer than before. "Hey," he shouted. I'm talking to you. I didn't respond. My brain was running through every possible excuse. He was drunk, he was high, he didn't know what he was saying. But none of that made sense. He sounded too calm for that, too deliberate. I reached the 4th floor and headed straight for my door. My hands were shaking as I dug through my bag for my keys. I could hear his footsteps coming up behind me, faster now. I got the key into the lock and shoved the door open just as he reached the top of the stairs. "Hey," he said again, louder this time. "Why are you ignoring me?" I didn't answer. I stepped inside and slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My hands were trembling so much I fumbled with the deadbolt, but I got it locked. Then I pressed my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, it was quiet. I could hear the rain outside, the hum of my fridge in the kitchen. Then there was a knock. 3 sharp raps, right at eye level. "Open the door," he said. I didn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. "I just want to talk," he said. His voice was muffled through the door, but it was calm, too calm. "Come on. Just open the door for a second." I stayed silent, hoping he'd think I wasn't there. "Why are you being like this?" he said, his voice rising. "You're acting like I'm some kind of freak." The doorknob rattled. He tried it once, twice, then slammed his fist against the door. "I know you're in there." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaking as I told the operator what was happening. She said to stay on the line and wait for the police. I crouched down by the door, trying to make myself as small as possible. The banging stopped. For a second, I thought maybe he'd left. Then I heard his voice again, quieter this time, almost a whisper. "You can't stay in there forever," he said. I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall, then silence. I stayed by the door until the police arrived. When they got there, they searched the building but didn't find him. The rain had washed away any tracks he might have left outside. They told me to stay somewhere else for the night, but I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again, that calm, quiet whisper. They never found him. But sometimes, when it rains, I still feel like someone's watching me. The storm hit harder than I expected. The wind screamed through the rigging, and rain lashed against the windows of the cabin. The rocking of the boat made it impossible to sleep, and I was already regretting not waiting for better weather before anchoring out here. It was supposed to be a quiet night on the water. Just me, my little boat, and some space to breathe. I decided to go up and check the lines. The anchor had held steady so far, but the wind had picked up, and the waves were getting rougher. I threw on my rain jacket and climbed out onto the deck, the cold rain soaking through my pants in seconds. The sea was black, except for the white caps on the waves, and visibility was terrible. My flashlight beam barely cut through the sheets of rain. I was securing the stern line when I saw a dark shape bobbing on the waves, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. At first, I thought it was debris, maybe a piece of driftwood or a lost buoy, but then a wave lifted it, and I realized it was another boat. It was small, about the same size as mine, and it didn't look like it was anchored. It was just drifting, tilting wildly with the waves. Then I heard a voice, faint but distinct, cutting through the wind and rain. "Hey! Over here! Help!" I froze, gripping the railing. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me!" I swung my flashlight toward the boat, squinting through the rain. There was a man on board, waving his arms. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his head, and he was shouting something I couldn't make out. My first instinct was to grab my radio, but I didn't want to leave him out there. The current was strong, and if his boat wasn't anchored, it could drift into the rocks. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted back, "Are you okay?" "Come closer," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I need help." I hesitated. The storm was bad, and maneuvering my boat closer to his in these conditions would be risky. Still, I couldn't just ignore him. I grabbed the radio from inside the cabin and called for the Coast Guard, giving them my position and explaining the situation. They said they'd send someone, but with the weather, it could take time. I returned to the deck, flashlight in hand. His boat had drifted closer, and I could see him more clearly now. He looked frantic, pacing the deck and waving his arms. "Hurry up," he shouted. "You need to help me." "What's wrong?" I called back. He stopped pacing and stared at me. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stood there, letting the rain hammer down on him. Then he pointed at me, his arm trembling. "You stole from me." The accusation caught me off guard. "What are you talking about?" I shouted. "You took my supplies," he yelled, his voice raw. "I know it was you. You think I didn't see you?" I shook my head, confused. "I don't even know you. I've been here all night." "You're lying," he screamed, his voice breaking into a guttural roar. He climbed onto the bow of his boat, wobbling as a wave rocked it violently. "You think you can just take what's mine and get away with it?" I felt my stomach twist. He wasn't acting like someone who needed help. His movements were erratic, his voice filled with rage. "Look, I don't have your supplies," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just stay on your boat. The Coast Guard is on their way." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that didn't match the situation. "You called them?" he sneered. "What are they gonna do, huh? They won't get here in time." "In time for what?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer. Instead, he climbed down into the cabin of his boat, disappearing from view. My heart was pounding now. I didn't know what he was doing, but every instinct was screaming at me to get back inside my own cabin. I stumbled down the steps, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the radio and called the Coast Guard again. "He's acting strange," I told them. "I think he's dangerous." The operator's voice was calm, but I could tell they were taking it seriously. They told me to stay inside and keep my distance. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, crouching by the window. His boat was closer now, barely 10 yards away. I could see his shadow moving inside, hear the thud of something heavy being dragged across the deck. Then he emerged, holding what looked like a long pole or a crowbar. My blood went cold. "Get out here," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the water. "You think you can hide from me?" I stayed as still as possible, hoping he couldn't see me through the rain-streaked window. He climbed onto the edge of his boat, leaning dangerously far over. For a moment, I thought he might fall into the water, but he caught his balance and pointed the crowbar at my boat. "You don't deserve any of it," he shouted. "You're just like the rest of them." I didn't know what he was talking about, but I didn't want to find out. I grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit and loaded it, my hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The man started pulling on a rope, dragging something heavy across the deck of his boat. It took me a moment to realize what he was doing. He was tying the boats together. If he got close enough, he could climb onto my deck. Panic set in. I aimed the flare gun out the window, shouting, "Stay back. I'm warning you." He froze, staring at the flare gun. For a moment, I thought he might back off. Then he smiled a slow, crooked grin that made my skin crawl. "You don't have it in you," he said. I fired the flare. It shot through the air, lighting up the stormy sky in a burst of red. The man ducked, losing his balance and tumbling backward onto his deck. His boat rocked violently, and the rope he'd been tying slipped out of his hands, splashing into the water. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I started my engine and pulled up the anchor as quickly as I could. The waves were rough, the wind nearly pushing me off course, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. As I sped away, I glanced back over my shoulder. His boat was drifting again, the light from his cabin flickering in the rain. He was standing on the deck, watching me go. Even from a distance, I could feel his eyes on me, burning with anger. The Coast Guard found me an hour later, safely anchored near the harbor. They searched the area where I'd been, but they didn't find his boat. They said it might have drifted further out to sea or been swamped by the waves. Part of me hoped they were right, but another part of me wasn't so sure. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally locked the doors. The rain had started earlier in the evening, and by the time the last customers were gone, it was coming down in thick sheets. The diner was silent except for the steady patter against the windows and the hum of the overhead lights. I'd finished wiping down the counters and was about to turn off the neon open sign when I saw him. He was standing outside, soaked to the bone, his dark coat clinging to him like a second skin. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and the rain streamed down his face. He didn't knock, didn't gesture, just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I hesitated. The diner was in the middle of nowhere, just off the highway, and I was the only one here. It wasn't unusual to get late-night stragglers, but something about him made me uneasy. Still, it was cold, and he looked miserable. I opened the door a crack, careful to keep the chain on. "We're closed," I said. "Please," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to come inside." I glanced out at the parking lot. His car wasn't there, just mine, sitting under the lone streetlight. "The storm's bad," he added. "I won't stay long." Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and stepped back. He stepped inside without thanking me, dripping water onto the linoleum. Up close, he looked worse. His cheeks were hollow, and his eyes were sharp and glassy, darting around the room like he was scanning it for something. I started to ask if he wanted coffee, but he interrupted me. "Do you work here alone?" His tone was flat, but there was something unsettling about the way he asked, like it wasn't really a question. Yeah," I said, gripping the edge of the counter. "But we're closed, so." "Must be quiet out here at night," he said, cutting me off again. "Just you and the highway." "Look, if you need to wait out the storm, fine," I said, trying to sound firm. "But I'm closing up." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to one of the booths and sat down, water pooling under him. His head turned slowly, taking in the room. It felt like he wasn't looking at the diner but searching for something specific. Or someone. I stayed behind the counter, my heart pounding. "You've worked here long?" he asked after a minute, his voice breaking the silence. "Couple of years," I said. "Why?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You like it?" "It's a job." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do they know about you?" he asked. My stomach tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Your boss. Your customers. Do they know what you've done?" The The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head slowly, like he didn't believe me. "No," he said. "I don't." I wanted to tell him to leave, but the words caught in my throat. He wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening me, but there was something about the way he spoke that made me feel trapped, like he'd already decided how this night was going to go. "I don't know you," I said finally. "You need to leave." He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "You don't remember me?" "No," I said. "I don't." His smile faded. For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes unblinking. Then he reached into his coat pocket. My hand shot to the phone on the counter, ready to call 911, but he didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he placed something small and metallic on the table, a key. "You dropped this," he said. I frowned. "That's not mine." "Isn't it?" he asked, tilting his head. "You sure?" "I've never seen it before." He pushed it toward the edge of the table, his fingers lingering on it. "You'd say that, wouldn't you?" I took a step back, my heart racing. "Look, I don't know what your problem is, but..." "My problem?" he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "My problem is people like you. People who think they can do whatever they want and get away with it." I froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he said, standing up. The movement was sudden, jerky, like he was barely holding himself together. "You think I didn't see you? You think I don't know?" My mouth was dry. "See me do what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he started pacing, his wet shoes squeaking against the floor. "I've been watching you," he said. "I've seen how you look at people. How you smile at them, like nothing's wrong. Like you're normal." I grabbed the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. "I'm calling the police." "No, you're not," he said, his voice calm again. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. "Because they won't believe you." I hit call anyway, pressing the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, and then the line went dead. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. No signal. There'd been signal earlier. I'd used my phone to check the weather. "I told you," he said. "They won't help you." I backed toward the door, my mind racing. "Get out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Now." He didn't move. "You can run," he said. "But it won't change anything." I didn't wait to hear what else he had to say. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock. The rain hit me like a wall as I stumbled outside, the cold air stealing my breath. My car was only a few feet away, but it felt like miles. I dug into my pocket for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. Behind me, the door to the diner slammed open. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the parking lot. He was standing in the doorway, his face expressionless. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, skidding onto the highway. The rain made it hard to see, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. My heart didn't stop racing until I saw the lights of a town up ahead. I never went back to that diner. The manager called the next day, asking why I'd left without locking up. I told him the truth, but he didn't believe me. Said the camera showed the place was empty when he arrived. Said there was no sign of anyone breaking in. But I know what happened. I know he was there. And I know he'll be back. It was a Friday night, and the game had wrapped up hours ago. The crowd cleared out fast once the rain started, leaving the field empty except for a few crumpled cups and snack wrappers stuck to the bleachers. By the time I was making my rounds, the parking lot was silent except for the sound of my boots on the asphalt and the rain tapping on the metal seats. I always did one last walk before locking up. It wasn't required, but it gave me peace of mind knowing no one was lurking where they shouldn't be. Most nights, I never found anything worse than a forgotten jacket or a half-eaten hot dog, but that night felt off. The rain wasn't heavy, just steady enough to soak through my coat if I stayed out too long. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting long, uneven shadows. I kept thinking I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, it was just empty benches and the wet field beyond. I was halfway through the bleachers on the visitor's side when I heard it. A low voice, barely audible over the rain. At first, I thought it was the wind carrying a distant echo, but then it came again, sharper this time, and it was close. I froze, scanning the rows above me. "Hello?" I called, my voice louder than I intended. It echoed back at me, but there was no response. I climbed up a few rows, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The light bounced off the wet metal seats, but everything looked empty. Then I heard a whisper. Clear this time. Words, but I couldn't make them out. I whipped the beam toward the far corner, and that's when I saw them. Two figures were crouched low between the rows, their backs pressed against the supports like they were trying to disappear. A man and a woman. They were soaked, their clothes clinging to them, and their faces were pale and tense. The man raised a hand, like he was trying to shield his face from the light. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The game's over. You're not supposed to be here." The woman spoke first. "Please," she said, her voice shaky. "We need to stay here." "This place is closed," I said, taking a step closer. "You can't stay." The man shifted, putting himself slightly in front of her. "We're hiding," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a strange edge to it, like he was trying to stay composed. "Someone's after us." That made me pause. "What do you mean, someone's after you?" The woman looked over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to appear behind them. "We were being followed," she said. "We thought we lost him, but we can't take any chances." "Followed from where?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. They didn't look like they'd been at the game. Their clothes were plain, dark, not the kind of thing people wore to a school event. The man was wearing a black jacket, torn at the elbow, and the woman had on a gray hoodie that was too big for her. Both of them were shivering. The man hesitated. "The road," he said finally. "We were walking, and a car kept circling back. We didn't know where else to go. It didn't sit right with me." "You're telling me you walked here in the rain, past the parking lot, and decided the bleachers were the safest place to hide?" The woman glanced at the man, her lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't look at her. "We didn't have time to think," he said. "We just needed to get out of sight." I didn't buy it, but I kept my face neutral. "Well, you can't stay here," I said. "I'm locking up." "Please," the woman said again, her voice rising. "Just for a little while. Until we're sure he's gone." "Who is he?" I asked. "What does he want?" The man's jaw tightened. "We don't know," he said quickly. Too quickly. He was just following us. I stared at them for a long moment. Their story didn't make sense, but the fear in their eyes looked real. Or at least the woman's did. The man, he was harder to read. His expression was guarded, almost like he was watching me for a reaction. "Look," I said, lowering my flashlight slightly. "If you're in trouble, I can call the police." The man's eyes flickered, and he took a half step forward. "No," he said sharply. "That's not necessary." "Why not?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "If someone's after you, wouldn't you want help?" The woman started to say something, but the man cut her off. "We just need time," he said. "That's all." Something about his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped back, keeping the flashlight steady on them. "I'm not leaving until you're out of here," I said. "So either you go on your own, or I call for backup." The woman looked panicked, but the man's expression hardened. "You don't understand," he said. "You shouldn't even be talking to us." That stopped me cold. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, his shoulders squaring like he was trying to intimidate me. "Just let us stay," he said, his voice low and firm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my heart pounding in my ears. "You need to leave," I said firmly. "Now." For a moment, no one moved. The rain was the only sound, hammering against the bleachers and the field below. Then, without warning, the man grabbed the woman's arm and yanked her to her feet. She let out a small yelp, but he didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on mine. "We're going," he said, his tone flat. "But if you see him, don't say anything." "See who?" I demanded, but he was already pulling her toward the far end of the bleachers. I followed at a distance, keeping the flashlight on them until they disappeared into the shadows. I waited, straining to hear their footsteps, but the rain swallowed everything. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, they were gone. I finished locking up in record time, my head on a swivel the entire way. I didn't see anyone else that night, no strange cars, no lurking figures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching. When I got back to the office, I checked the security footage. The cameras covered most of the field and parking lot, but there was nothing. No sign of the man or the woman. No one entering or leaving. I don't know who they were or what they were running from. But the way the man looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, it still keeps me up at night. The storm had been rolling in for hours, the kind that felt like it was building into something worse. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain drummed steadily against the roof. I'd spent most of the evening reading, the house quiet except for the occasional crack of thunder. It was late, maybe around 11, when I first heard the knocking. It was faint at first, almost like the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, 3 sharp raps on the front door. I froze, my book slipping from my hands. No one ever came out this way, especially not during weather like this. I stood up slowly, my pulse already quickening, and made my way to the door. The porch light was on, casting a dim glow over the front step. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing there, hunched against the rain. He had a hood pulled up over his head, water dripping off his jacket. He knocked again, harder this time, and I could just make out his voice. "Hello? Can you help me?" I didn't open the door. Something about the way he stood too close, like he was leaning into the doorframe, put me on edge. "What do you want?" I called through the door. "Sorry to bother you," he said. His voice was steady but loud enough to carry over the storm. "I'm lost. My phone's dead, and I just need some directions." I hesitated, glancing back toward the living room where my phone sat on the coffee table. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked. I was headed to Ridgefield, he said, but I think I took a wrong turn a while back. Do you have a map, maybe? Or could I use your phone? His story didn't make sense. Ridgefield was at least 20 miles away, and you'd have to go out of your way to end up on my street. I stepped back from the door, suddenly aware of how isolated the house felt. There were no neighbors close by, and with the storm, no one would hear anything if something went wrong. I don't have a map, I said carefully, and I'm not comfortable letting you in. There was a pause. I couldn't see his face clearly through the peephole, but he shifted slightly, like he was leaning to the side. I understand, he said. Could you at least tell me where the nearest main road is? That's when I noticed it. Movement in the driveway, just beyond the porch light's reach. I leaned closer to the peephole, squinting into the dark, and my stomach dropped. There was someone else out there, crouched low behind my car. I could just make out the outline of their shape, hunched and motionless, as if they were waiting for something. My heart started racing. You're not alone, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Who's out there with you? What? The man on the porch said, sounding genuinely confused. It's just me. Don't lie to me, I snapped. I see someone behind my car. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he let out a short laugh, but it didn't sound right. It was too forced, like he was trying to cover something up. You must be mistaken, he said. It's just the rain playing tricks on you. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. My phone was still in the living room. I didn't want to take my eyes off the front door, but I needed to call for help. You need to leave, I said firmly. I'm not helping you. His tone changed then, sharper and more insistent. Ma'am, I just need a little help. It'll only take a second. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and ran for my phone. I snatched it off the coffee table, my hand shaking as I unlocked it. My fingers fumbled over the screen as I dialed 911, but before I could press the call button, I heard something. A faint scrape, like metal on metal. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound was coming from the back of the house. There was no way he could have gotten there so fast. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was the second person at the back door now? Had they split up? I edged toward the kitchen, keeping my footsteps as quiet as possible. The back door had a small window, and as I crept closer, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was trying to jimmy the lock with what looked like a crowbar. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away slowly, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The 911 operator picked up as I hit the call button, and I whispered into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. There are 2 men outside my house, I said. One's at the front door, and the other's trying to break in through the back. The operator's voice was calm, but I barely registered what she was saying. My focus was on the back door, where the crowbar was still working at the lock. I told her my address, my voice shaking, and she assured me that help was on the way. Then the knocking at the front door started again, harder this time. It wasn't just a knock, it was pounding, like he was trying to break the door down. Ma'am, the operator said in my ear, can you get to a safe place? I scanned the room, my mind racing. The only thing I could think of was the bathroom at the end of the hall. It had a lock, and it was far enough from both doors that I might have a chance to hide. I whispered into the phone, I'm going to the bathroom, and started moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The pounding at the front door grew louder, and I could hear the man shouting now, his voice muffled but angry. Open the door, he yelled. You can't just ignore me. I slipped into the bathroom and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I sat on the floor, clutching the phone, and tried to keep my breathing quiet. The operator stayed on the line with me, asking questions I could barely process. How many people? Were they armed? I didn't know. All I could do was listen to the sounds of the men outside, the pounding at the front door and the scraping at the back. Then, suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence was worse. I strained to hear anything, but the storm drowned out most of the faint sounds from outside. Minutes passed like hours, and I kept waiting for something, footsteps, voices, the sound of breaking glass, but there was nothing. Finally, I heard a new sound. Sirens. The relief was so overwhelming I almost started crying. The flashing lights cut through the rain, and I could hear the voices of the officers calling out as they approached the house. I stayed in the bathroom until they knocked on the door and announced themselves. When I came out, the officers were already searching the property. They found the crowbar near the back door and muddy footprints leading away from the house, but the men were gone. The officer in charge told me they'd patrol the area and let me know if they found anything, but I could tell he didn't expect much. I didn't sleep that night. Every time the wind rattled the windows or the rain hit the roof, I thought they were coming back. They never did, but the thought of what might have happened if I'd opened the door still haunts me. It was about 9:45, and I'd been finishing up paperwork at the shop. The bays were closed, and the last car had rolled out hours ago. I'd been working late because I wanted to get ahead for the week, and the place was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights and the faint buzz of a radio I'd left on low. I just started locking up when I noticed the headlights through the front window. A car pulled into the lot, parking haphazardly near the garage entrance. The engine sputtered off, and the door slammed. I could see the figure of a man stepping out, his silhouette cutting against the beams of the headlights. He stood there for a second, then started walking toward the building. We're not a 24-hour shop. The signs out front clearly say when we're open, and we've had our share of folks who ignore them, but something about the way this guy moved caught my attention. He didn't stroll up like someone looking for a quick favor. He marched, shoulders hunched, steps deliberate. When he reached the door, he didn't knock. He pounded 3 heavy thuds with his fist. I stayed behind the counter, watching him through the glass. He looked rough. His jacket was greasy, his hair stuck out in patches under a dirty baseball cap, and his face was set in a hard scowl. Something was off, but I wasn't about to ignore him. I walked over, unlocked the door just a crack, and leaned into it. "Sorry, we're closed," I said. "What can I do for you?" "My car broke down," he said, his voice gruff. "You need to fix it." I frowned. "Like I said, we're closed for the night. I can schedule you for tomorrow morning." "I'm not waiting until tomorrow." He cut me off, shutting the door hard enough to make it bump against my shoulder. I need it fixed now. I stepped back and closed the door firmly. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice steady, "but we're not open. There's nothing I can do for you tonight." His face twisted, and he pointed back toward the lot. "It's just a simple fix," he said, voice rising. "Battery's dead, maybe the alternator." "I don't know." "You're a mechanic. You're supposed to fix cars." "And I will," I said, "during business hours." I started to close the door, but his hand shot out, catching it before it latched. The suddenness of it startled me. He leaned into the gap, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm joking?" he said. "You think I'm asking?" I didn't know what to say. He was bigger than me, and his whole posture screamed aggression. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You need to leave," I said firmly. "If you don't, I'll have to call the police." That set him off. He pushed the door harder, and I had to throw my weight against it to keep him out. "You think the cops are gonna help you?" he snarled. "I'm not leaving until my car is fixed." I didn't respond. I just shoved the door shut and locked it. He slammed his fist against the glass, hard enough to make it rattle, but it held. He stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, his face inches from the window. Then he turned and stalked back toward his car. I thought he'd given up. I stayed where I was, watching as he paced near his car, muttering to himself. My hands were shaking, but I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation as quickly as I could. The operator assured me someone would be dispatched, but she couldn't tell me how long it would take. While I was on the phone, the man went to his trunk. He popped it open, and I saw him rummaging around before pulling something out. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as he walked back toward the shop, the light caught on it, a tire iron. My stomach dropped. I told the operator what I was seeing, and she told me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. I backed away from the front door, my eyes locked on the man as he approached. He held the tire iron loosely, almost casually, but his expression was anything but. He reached the door and stood there for a moment, staring through the glass. Then, without warning, he swung the tire iron hard against the door. The impact was deafening, the glass spiderwebbing but not breaking. I flinched, clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. He swung again and again, each hit sending cracks spreading through the glass. "Open the door," he shouted, his voice raw with anger. "Open it, or I'll come in anyway." I retreated further into the shop, my mind racing. The back door was locked, but it wasn't as sturdy as the front. If he realized there was another way in, I was screwed. I looked around for something, anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a wrench lying on the workbench, and I grabbed it, holding it tightly in my shaking hand. The banging stopped. I turned back toward the front, my breath caught in my throat. The man was gone. The car was still in the lot, headlights glaring, but he was nowhere to be seen. I stayed where I was, listening intently. The rain had picked up, the sound of it against the roof nearly drowning out everything else. Then I heard it, a faint scraping, coming from the side of the building. My blood turned to ice. He was trying the side door. I moved quickly but quietly, making my way toward the back of the shop. There was no way I could stop him if he got in, but I could hide. The storage closet was small and cramped, but it had a lock. I slipped inside and closed the door as quietly as I could, sliding the lock into place. The scraping turned into a metallic clatter, and I realized he was trying to pry the side door open with the tire iron. My hands were slick with sweat, the wrench slipping slightly as I gripped it. I could hear him muttering to himself again, though I couldn't make out the words. Minutes passed like hours. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. Then, finally, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The noise outside stopped. There was a heavy thud, like he'd dropped the tire iron, followed by the sound of footsteps running across the lot. I stayed in the closet, my heart hammering in my chest, until I heard the voices of the officers shouting outside. When I finally stepped out, the police were in the lot, their flashlights cutting through the rain. The man was gone, but they found his car abandoned by the side of the road a few miles away. They told me they'd keep an eye out for him, but I could tell they didn't think he'd be caught. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard the sound of the tire iron against the door. I still don't know what his real plan was, but I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out. It had been raining since late afternoon, the kind that doesn't let up, where the streets shine under the lights, and everything feels heavier. The convenience store was quiet that evening, quieter than usual. People didn't want to venture out in weather like that, so it was just me and the hum of the refrigerators in the back. The clock was creeping toward 10, time to lock up for the night. I'd already wiped down the counter and stocked the shelves during the lulls. The rain made everything feel slower, like it was stretching the last hour just to mess with me. I first noticed him about 20 minutes before closing. He wasn't inside. He was just standing out by the window, half hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought he might just be waiting for someone, but then I realized he wasn't under the awning or anything. He was just standing in the rain, letting it soak him through. His jacket was dark, and his hood was down, water dripping from his hair. He wasn't looking around like someone waiting for a ride. He was looking in. At me. I told myself not to overthink it. Sometimes people act weird. Maybe he was just trying to get out of the rain and didn't want to come inside. But the way he stood there, so still, his face pale and his eyes locked on the window, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I busied myself behind the counter, trying to ignore him. I restocked the cigarette case, checked inventory sheets, anything to avoid looking back at the window. But every time I glanced up, he was still there, unmoving, still staring. 10 o'clock rolled around, and I told myself it was fine. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't tried to come in or knock on the window. Maybe he was just strange. I grabbed the keys from under the counter and headed toward the door to lock up. When I got closer, I could see him better through the glass. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, and his jacket looked like it was clinging to him. But what stood out were his hands. He wasn't just standing there. He was holding something. A pair of gloves. Thick, black leather ones. He wasn't wearing them. He was holding them out in front of him, like he was waiting to give them to someone. I stopped in my tracks, still on the inside of the door. He saw me approaching, and for the first time, he moved. He stepped closer, out of the shadows, so he was right up against the glass. He raised the gloves slightly, as if to show them to me. I didn't open the door. I didn't even unlock it. I just stood there, gripping the keys in my hand, my mind racing. Was he trying to sell them? Was he going to ask me to let him in? None of it made sense. I shook my head at him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave, but he just stayed there. His lips moved like he was saying something, but I couldn't hear him through the glass. I mouthed, "We're closed," pointing at the hours sign on the door. He didn't react. He just kept mouthing something, over and over. I thought about opening the door just to crack to hear him, but something told me not to. My gut was screaming at me to stay where I was. Instead, I took a step back, pretending to lock the door. It was already locked, but I turned the key in the air anyway, hoping he'd see the gesture and go away. He didn't. Instead, he pressed the gloves against the glass. His hands were trembling now, his fingers clutching the leather tightly. I could see his knuckles turning white. That was when I noticed something else. His jacket wasn't just wet from the rain. It was darker in some spots, and there was a streak of something down the front of it. I told myself it was just water, maybe mud from walking through puddles. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took another step back. My hand was shaking, and I fumbled with the keys. I just needed to get to the back room and call someone, anyone. My manager, the cops, I didn't care at that point. I turned away from the door, walking quickly toward the back. As soon as I moved, I heard the sound. It was a dull, heavy thud. I turned my head just enough to see him banging the gloves against the glass. Not with force, not like he was trying to break it, but with this slow, deliberate rhythm. Like he was knocking, but using the gloves instead of his fist. My heart was pounding as I reached the counter. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, barely able to get the words out when the operator answered. I told her there was a man outside the store, acting strange, refusing to leave. She asked if he'd threatened me, and I said no, but my voice cracked as I said it. He hadn't done anything yet, but everything about him felt wrong. She told me to stay on the line, and that officers would be dispatched. I stayed crouched behind the counter, peeking out just enough to see the door. He was still there, still holding the gloves, but now he pressed his forehead against the glass too. His breath fogged up the window in short, uneven bursts. Then, just as suddenly as he'd started, he stopped. He straightened up, letting the gloves fall to his side. He stood there for a moment, staring through the window, his eyes searching the store. Then he turned and walked away. I stayed on the phone with the operator until the police arrived. They searched the lot and the surrounding area, but he was gone. The gloves were still there, lying in a puddle by the door. One of the officers picked them up, turning them over in his hands. They were soaked, and the leather had started to stiffen from the cold. "Is this blood?" he asked his partner, holding them up under the light. There were dark stains smeared across the palms, stains that hadn't come from the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of the gloves hitting the glass, soft but insistent, like he was trying to get in. The police said they'd keep an eye out, but they didn't seem optimistic. They didn't even take the gloves with them. They just left them sitting on the counter, like some kind of forgotten relic. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I haven't worked a closing shift since. And I never will again. I was driving home late one night after finishing up a long shift at work. The rain was coming down hard, making it almost impossible to see past the windshield. I was just trying to get home and sleep, but the roads were slick, and the headlights reflected off the wet asphalt, making everything seem blurry. I usually take the same route back, the quieter road that goes through the woods, but that night it felt like I was the only one out there. I was about 5 miles from my place when I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road, just off the shoulder, waving her arms. The rain was so heavy I could barely make her out at first. I slowed the car down, unsure of what to do. People don't usually stand out in the rain at this hour. It didn't seem right, but something about the way she was waving, desperate, but not frantic, made me stop. I pulled over and turned on the hazard lights. As soon as I stopped, she came rushing up to the car. Her clothes were soaked through, her hair matted to her face, and she looked terrified. I rolled the window down, just a little at first, not sure what kind of situation I was getting into. "Please help me," she said, her voice shaky and low. "I need a ride. They're after me." I froze for a second. The way she said it, like it wasn't just a plea for help but a warning, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My first thought was to tell her I'd call the police. I wanted to help, but something felt wrong. The rain was coming down so hard, the visibility was terrible, and she didn't look like someone stranded with car trouble. She looked out of place. But before I could respond, I heard something. 2 voices from the woods, deep and loud, cutting through the sound of the rain. I looked up and saw them, 2 men, coming out of the trees, walking toward the car. One of them had a flashlight in his hand, shining it directly at me. "Get back in your car and drive off," the man with the flashlight said, his tone calm but demanding. "That woman's a runaway. You don't want to get involved." The other man said nothing, just stood behind him, arms crossed, looking at me like he was ready for trouble. I didn't know what to make of it. I glanced back at the woman. She looked terrified, shaking her head now, pleading with me not to listen to them. "They're lying," she cried. "Please, they're going to hurt me. You have to help me." I didn't know what to believe. The whole thing felt wrong. If she was telling the truth, then those two men were a serious threat. But if they were telling the truth, then I was getting involved in something I might not be able to get out of. I felt like I was being pulled in two directions, and the longer I waited, the more I felt trapped. "Get in the car, lady," the man with the flashlight said, his voice harder now. "You don't want to make this worse." The other man took a step forward, his posture aggressive, like he was daring me to do something. I wasn't an idiot. I knew how this could end if I made the wrong move. I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want to get into a fight, especially with two men who clearly weren't scared of anything. I looked at the woman one last time. She was shaking, her eyes wide, and I could see the fear on her face. But something about the way she looked at me made me hesitate. She wasn't just scared. She looked like she was terrified of them, like she knew what they were capable of. Before I could make a decision, the man with the flashlight stepped closer to the car, shining the light directly in my face. I said, "Get in the car and leave. Now." I froze. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and the air felt thick, like something was about to snap. I thought about driving off, but something in my gut told me that wouldn't end well. If they were dangerous, if they weren't really who they said they were, I wouldn't get far before they caught up to me. I knew then that I had to make a decision fast. I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I threw the car in reverse. I didn't look back, didn't check the rearview mirror. I just slammed the gas pedal down and backed the car up as quickly as I could. The rain made the tires slip, but I managed to get the car turned around and driving down the road again. My heart was racing, and I could hear the sound of my tires splashing through puddles as I sped away. I didn't stop until I was a few miles down the road, where I pulled off to the side and parked in a small gas station lot. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to calm my breathing. I could still hear their voices in my head, the man with the flashlight, the woman's cries. I sat there for a while, trying to process everything that had happened. Part of me kept telling myself I had done the right thing, that getting involved in that situation could have ended badly. But there was another part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that I had just left someone in danger. I didn't know if the woman was really who she said she was or if those men were really after her, but something about that whole encounter didn't sit right. When I felt like I could breathe again, I called the police. I told them what had happened, what I had seen, and where it all took place. They didn't seem to take me seriously at first, but I gave them enough details to make them at least listen. They promised they would send someone out to check the area. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I don't know what happened to that woman or those two men. I don't know if they were really a threat or if I had just imagined the whole thing. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I drive down that road. What if I made the wrong choice? What if she needed me, and I left her to face them alone? I'll never know. All I know is that I was lucky to get out of that situation. Whatever it was, I don't think I'll ever be in a position where I have to make that kind of decision again. I worked a late shift at a small diner on the edge of town. It's one of those places that's always a little too quiet at night, and you get used to the feeling of the place emptying out as the hours drag on. The kind of diner where you serve coffee to the same few faces and clean the counters while you wait for the clock to hit the time you can finally go home. It was a Thursday night. The usual quiet evening. I had just finished wiping down the last of the tables, and the few customers that had come in for dinner had already left. There were only a couple of hours left until closing time, and I was looking forward to going home and getting some sleep. It had been a long day. The diner was nearly empty, save for me and the sound of the dishwasher running in the back. It had started raining about an hour ago, just light enough to make the parking lot slick and shiny, but not heavy enough to make it difficult to see out the big windows. I had just locked the front door, checked the clock, and was preparing to do a final sweep when I noticed the headlights. At first, I thought maybe someone had come back for something they'd forgotten, or maybe it was just someone passing by. But then I saw the car was parked in the same spot for a good minute, the headlights still on, shining through the rain. The car wasn't moving. I glanced over to the window again, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever was inside, but I couldn't make out anything through the glare of the headlights. No movement. No sign of anyone. I froze for a moment, unsure if I should ignore it or go check. The lot was empty except for that car. No other vehicles around. No customers walking to or from their cars. It felt strange. The feeling crawled up the back of my neck like someone was standing just behind me, breathing too close. It's hard to describe, but something about it made me uneasy. I had worked the late shift countless times, but this was different. I waited a little longer, but the car didn't move. It just sat there, idling with the headlights on, barely lighting the small parking lot. I didn't know what to do. The other staff had already left for the night, and I was alone. Maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe they needed help. But it was starting to get late, and I didn't want to deal with whatever this was. Eventually, I decided to step outside, just to see if anyone needed anything. Maybe I could just get them to leave and close up without any trouble. I grabbed my jacket from behind the counter, tucked my phone into my pocket, and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I noticed something unusual. There was a note stuck to the outside of the door. Not just taped to the glass, but pressed directly onto it, like someone had purposely placed it there, just out of view. I stopped for a second, my hand frozen in midair, staring at it. The rain had already started to smear the ink on the outside of the window, but it was still legible enough to read. "We're watching." It was simple. No signature, no other message. Just those words. And the more I stared at it, the more I felt my stomach twist. The air in the diner seemed to grow colder, like I wasn't alone anymore. I stepped back from the door. I didn't know why I felt so scared. There was nothing physically threatening about the note, nothing that seemed like an immediate danger, but the feeling in my gut told me something was very, very wrong. Who would leave a note like that? And why now? My first thought was to lock the door and call the police. But when I turned back to the car, I saw something that made my heart drop. The headlights were still on, but there was no one inside. The car was completely empty. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was standing in the shadows, waiting for me to make my move. I slowly moved back to the counter, keeping my eyes on the parking lot, my breath coming faster than it should. The car was still there, but there was nothing else. No movement, no sign of anyone. It was just the rain and the silence. I wasn't sure what to do next. I felt stuck. If I called the police, what would I even tell them? That there was a note on the door? That someone was watching the diner from their car? I looked at the note again. The words kept replaying in my head. "We're watching." I felt ridiculous for even thinking about it. Who would do something like that? but something about the situation just felt off. The way the note was placed, the way the car was just sitting there, completely still, and the strange, suffocating silence that had taken over the diner. I didn't know who or what was out there, but I had a terrible feeling that I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and quickly dialed my best friend. I needed someone to talk to, even if it was just to calm my nerves. It rang a few times before she picked up. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, sounding half asleep. "Something's wrong," I said, my voice shaky. "There's a car parked outside, and there's this note on the door. It says..." "What does it say?" she interrupted, sounding more awake now. "We're watching," I said, almost whispering it, as if the words might somehow make the situation worse. There was silence on the other end for a moment. I didn't know if she was thinking I was overreacting or if she was as scared as I was. "Okay," she said, her voice now calm but serious. "Listen, just lock the door and stay inside. I'm calling the cops, all right? Don't open the door for anyone. Don't do anything until they get there." I hung up without saying anything else. My hands were trembling now, and I couldn't sit still. I didn't know what was happening or who had left that note, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. I locked the door, checked the back windows, and kept my phone in my hand, just in case. The minutes dragged on, every little noise in the diner making me jump. The rain was still coming down outside, but nothing changed. No cars drove by. No one knocked on the door. The parking lot stayed empty. About 10 minutes later, I saw the flashing lights from the police cars through the front window. They pulled into the lot, and I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. The officers got out, approached the car, and looked around, checking the area. I stepped back from the door, too scared to even look at them directly. When they knocked on the door, I unlocked it, and they came inside. They asked me to explain everything, and I showed them the note. They told me it was good I called and that they would check the area, but honestly, I don't think they believed me. They didn't find anything, no other cars, no one lurking in the rain. Just the empty car with its headlights still on, like someone had been waiting there forever. They told me to keep the doors locked and not to worry too much, that it was probably a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. That note, those words, they hadn't felt like a joke. The rest of the night passed quietly. I didn't leave the diner until the morning, and when I went back the next night, everything was normal. The parking lot was empty, the lights were bright, and there was nothing unusual about the place. But I'll never forget that feeling. The one that told me someone had been watching me. I don't know how to start this, but I feel like I need to get it out. I don't really talk about it with anyone, but I need to write this down, or else I'll never stop thinking about it. It happened last year, late in the fall, when the weather had just started to turn. The days were getting shorter, the air was colder, and it seemed like every storm had hit all at once. It was a Wednesday night, around 10:30, when I first heard the shouting. I was sitting in the living room, just flipping through the channels on TV. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I wasn't paying much attention to it, just another storm passing through. But then I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then it happened again. A shout. It was distant, but there was something about it that made my heart drop into my stomach. I got up from the couch, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. I peered through the living room window, but the rain was coming down so hard that I couldn't see much of anything. Just blurred shapes in the dark, the kind of sight you get when it's storming so badly that you can barely see out the window. But I could hear it clearly now. Someone shouting, It wasn't just random noise. It was frantic, like someone was in distress. I stood there for a minute, not sure what to do. I debated calling the police, but then I thought, what if it's just someone lost or in trouble? What if I'm the only one nearby who could help? I grabbed my jacket off the coat rack by the door, threw it on, and opened the front door. I don't know why I didn't just stay inside. Maybe I was trying to be the good guy, or maybe I was just curious. But once that door swung open, I regretted it. The cold air hit me immediately, and the rain was relentless, pouring down in sheets. The wind was so strong it almost pushed me back inside. The shouting was louder now. It was coming from somewhere near the edge of my yard, out by the side of the road. I squinted, trying to make out any movement through the dark and rain. I didn't see anyone at first, but then something caught my eye. A figure was standing at the edge of my yard, moving slowly toward me. I don't know why, but I wasn't scared at first. Maybe I was just trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong. But when the figure took another step forward, I realized I could see them more clearly now. The person was soaked through, drenched completely in rain, their clothes hanging off them like they'd been out in it for hours. They were walking slowly, like they were dragging their feet. The first thing I noticed was how wrong they looked. I don't know how else to put it. There was something unsettling about their movements, the way they swayed from side to side as if they were walking against the wind, struggling to keep their balance. I stepped out onto the porch, unsure of what to do. The person was still coming closer, and now that I could hear them more clearly, I realized they weren't just shouting. They were calling out my name, over and over again. John. John. I've been looking for you, John. I froze. How did they know my name? I hadn't seen this person before in my life. They were getting closer now, and I could make out their face. I could see their expression, and it looked desperate. They weren't smiling, but they weren't frowning either. It was like their face was stuck in a strange, blank expression, as though they were too tired to care about anything anymore. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I should just go back inside or ask if they were all right. But then they stopped in front of me, just a few feet from the porch, still drenched in rain. Their hair was plastered to their face, and their clothes were torn in places. I was standing there in the open, completely exposed. The wind was howling around us, making everything feel louder than it should have been. I've been looking for you, John, the person said again. This time, their voice was quieter, hoarse from shouting. You don't remember me, do you? I shook my head. I'm sorry. I don't know who you are. The person's eyes locked onto mine, and I swear, it felt like something shifted in the air between us. There was this intensity in their gaze, like they were looking right through me. I couldn't look away, even if I wanted to. You don't remember me? They said again, voice shaking. There was this mix of confusion and anger in their tone now, like they were trying to figure out why I didn't recognize them. You really don't know me? After everything? Everything? What was this person talking about? I could feel my stomach tightening. I had no idea what they meant, but something about the whole situation was starting to feel way more serious than I was ready for. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, the person took a step closer. I instinctively stepped back, just a little, but it was enough for them to notice. The look on their face changed again. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't confusion either. It was something darker. Disappointment. Like I had just let them down somehow. You don't remember, John? They looked down, shaking their head, then back up at me. We've been through this before, haven't we? You remember, don't you? I stepped back again. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I knew one thing. I wasn't about to get any closer. There was something wrong with this person. I could feel it deep in my bones. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking now. "I really don't know you. Please, just go. I'll call someone for help." But the person didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me like I had betrayed them. I didn't know if they were going to hurt me or if they just didn't care anymore, but I knew I needed to get out of this situation. "Just go," I repeated, more forcefully this time. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had never been this scared in my life. For a moment, it felt like the rain had stopped. Like the world had gone completely still. And then, just like that, the person turned and walked away. Slowly at first, then faster, until they disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. I don't know who they were or what they wanted from me, but I've never forgotten that night. Every time it rains, I think about that figure, standing there in the storm, calling my name. And I still don't know what they meant when they said they had been looking for me. I haven't seen them again since, but I still hear that voice sometimes, in my head. I can't shake it. It's hard for me to even write this, but I think I need to get it out. It's been almost a year now, but I still think about it. I keep hoping that if I write it down, it'll make more sense, like I can shake it off or something. But the truth is, it doesn't. It still haunts me. It all started on a Tuesday evening in early autumn. I had just finished work and was on my way home when the storm hit. The weather had been bad all day, but by the time I got to the train station, the rain was coming down so hard I could barely see. I had planned to take the train back, but with the rain and the wind, I knew it would be better to wait a bit before going outside. The station wasn't very busy, which was pretty normal for that time of night. A few people had already left for their trains, and there wasn't anyone else in sight except for the station attendant who was behind the counter, half hidden from view. I stood there in the lobby for a while, watching the storm through the glass doors. The noise of the rain against the windows was deafening. It felt good to be indoors, safe from the storm, even if it meant waiting a little longer. I started checking my phone, half lost in my thoughts, when I heard the first sound that caught my attention. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own shoes against the floor, but when I listened more carefully, I realized it was different. It was slower, deliberate. I looked up, thinking maybe the attendant was moving around, but when I glanced at the counter, the attendant wasn't there. I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe I was just too tired from the day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps echoed again, louder this time. I quickly glanced around the station. The lobby was mostly empty, the benches lined up in neat rows, and the lights flickered a bit from the storm outside. No one was in sight. I checked my phone again, and the time was ticking by slowly. No one else had entered, and I hadn't heard the sound of any trains arriving or leaving. The only noise was the storm and the footsteps. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check the back of the station. There was a hallway that led to the restrooms and an employee-only area, but I wasn't expecting anyone back there. The hallway was dimly lit, almost as if the station didn't want to waste any electricity on a part of the station no one used. I walked toward the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible, but as I reached the threshold, I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there, listening intently, but there was nothing. Just the sound of the rain battering the building. I thought maybe I'd imagined it all, or that I was just spooked from being alone, so I started to turn back toward the main lobby. That's when I heard it again. A soft, shuffling noise. It was coming from deeper in the hallway. I froze. It wasn't the sound of someone walking. It was more like someone was moving deliberately, but staying just out of sight. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like someone was there, deliberately avoiding being seen. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to sound crazy. It was just a noise. Just a storm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I debated going back to the main lobby to wait for the storm to pass, but for some reason, I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, and my breath was shallow. I stayed where I was, hoping that whatever or whoever was in the hallway would just leave. But then the shuffling started again, this time closer. Too close. I don't know why I did it, but I slowly stepped into the hallway, careful not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just some random person, maybe a homeless person or someone taking shelter, but something in my gut told me it was worse than that. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them. I could feel their presence. The hallway was empty, and the restroom doors were shut. The flickering light above my head made everything feel distorted, like I was in a dream. I took a few more steps, hoping to find the source of the noise, but then I heard something that made me freeze completely. A voice. It was low and barely audible, but I heard it clear as day. You shouldn't be here. I stood there for a long moment, too scared to breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought for sure they would hear it. I turned back toward the lobby and started to walk quickly. I couldn't bring myself to run, but I wanted to get as far from the hallway as possible. My mind was racing, but my feet felt like they were stuck in cement. The air in the station felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing in on me from all sides. When I reached the lobby, I looked around one last time. There was still no one in sight. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like someone was waiting for me, just out of sight. I couldn't put it into words, but it was the most suffocating sensation I've ever felt. I grabbed my things and left the station as fast as I could, not bothering to check the parking lot or the surroundings. I just wanted to get to my car, lock the doors, and drive away. I didn't care if I was drenched by the rain, I just had to get out of there. When I got to my car and slammed the door shut, I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but I didn't care anymore. I drove away from that station without looking back. I didn't go to the police or tell anyone else about what happened. I couldn't explain it. And I didn't want to sound crazy. But every time I pass that station, I can't help but feel that same chill. I know something was there that night. Someone was there. And they were deliberately staying out of my sight. It happened last summer, on a night that started off like any other, but I'll never forget it. I still don't like driving in the rain now. I can't even explain why, but the fear's still there. It was about 10:30 p.m., and I had just finished a long shift at work. I was exhausted but relieved to be heading home. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wipers on my car were struggling to keep up with the downpour. The roads were slick, and I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The drive should have taken about 30 minutes, but the weather made it feel like an eternity. I was about halfway home, cruising down a stretch of road that's mostly empty, no streetlights, no houses, just trees on both sides. It's the kind of road where you're not expecting to see anyone else, especially at this time of night. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights coming from the opposite direction. The car was pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down, thinking maybe they were having car trouble or something. I figured I should stop and see if they needed help. There wasn't anyone else around, and it felt like the right thing to do, you know? I pulled up behind the car, just enough to be out of the way of traffic. It was a dark sedan, and the figure standing next to it was hard to make out because of the rain and the mist. The person raised their hand as if to wave, so I figured they saw me and needed help. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out a little, asking, "You need a hand?" The person was soaked, drenched from head to toe. They looked like they'd been standing out there for a while. Their clothes were wet and clinging to them, and I could hear the rain beating down around us. They didn't answer me right away, which felt a bit off, but I didn't think much of it. After a moment, the person moved toward my car. I could see their face now, just enough to make out their features. They looked tired, maybe even a little desperate, but there was something strange about their expression. Like they were watching me too closely, almost studying me. "Can you help me out?" the person asked, their voice low and shaky. I nodded, but something was making my stomach turn. I don't know why, but my instincts were starting to go off. I should have just driven away, but I didn't. I told myself I was overthinking it. I got out of my car, making sure to lock the doors, and walked toward them. As I got closer, I realized they were holding something in their hand. At first, I thought it was a flashlight or something to signal me, but when they lifted it, I saw the unmistakable shape of a gun. I froze. My heart dropped into my stomach. The man wasn't asking for help, he was demanding something. "Get in the car," he said, his voice rough, like he was trying to hold it together but couldn't quite do it. I stared at him, trying to process what was happening. I didn't know if it was a joke or if he was just desperate, but the look in his eyes told me this wasn't a game. His hand was shaking slightly, but the gun was still pointed directly at me. "Come on." "Get in," he repeated, his voice harsher this time. I took a step back, trying to get a grip on myself. My brain was telling me to stay calm, to think, but all I could focus on was the weapon. I didn't want to make a move that would make him feel threatened, but at the same time, I knew I had to protect myself. I glanced at my car, which was still a few feet away. I could try to make a run for it, but I didn't know if I could get there fast enough. And I didn't know if he'd shoot if I tried. He didn't seem like the kind of person you could talk your way out of. He looked like he had nothing to lose. I took another step back, my voice coming out quieter than I wanted. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I don't want any trouble." His eyes narrowed, and the gun moved slightly, the barrel still pointed in my direction. "You don't get to decide what happens here. Get in the damn car." I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to figure out my options. I could try to run for it, but if he chased me, I might not make it. There was no one around to help, no one to hear me if I screamed. Suddenly, something in me snapped. I don't even know where it came from, but I made a split-second decision. I took a step to the side, as if I was moving toward my car, but I didn't stop. I just turned and bolted. I ran as fast as I could, hearing the man shout behind me, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I felt like my legs were moving in slow motion, my heart pounding in my chest, but I pushed myself harder, faster. I reached my car and yanked the door open, scrambling inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole time, I heard the man yelling at me, but I didn't care. I managed to start the car, slam it into drive, and sped off, not daring to look back. I didn't even think about where I was going. I just needed to get away, to get as far from that man as possible. I kept driving until I found a well-lit gas station and pulled in, trying to catch my breath. I stayed there for a while, making sure he wasn't following me, before I finally drove home. When I got back, I locked all the doors, and I don't think I slept much that night. I still don't know what that man wanted. I don't know if he was truly desperate or if something else was going on. But I'm lucky I didn't get any closer to that gun, and I'll never forget the feeling of being completely helpless, standing there in the rain with someone who could have taken everything from me. To this day, I still drive carefully around that stretch of road, especially when it's stormy. I've never seen that man again, but I'm always looking, just in case. It's not something I ever want to go through again. It happened last year, and I'll never forget it. I still get a little uneasy when I think about it, especially when I'm driving at night or in storms. It's not something you can easily shake off. I was driving home from a business trip, a 3-hour drive through mostly empty roads. It had been a long day, and I was looking forward to getting home. Of course, the weather didn't help. It had started raining lightly around the time I left, but as the night went on, the storm got worse. The rain turned into sheets, and the wind picked up. The visibility was terrible. I could barely see the road ahead of me, and the wipers on my car could barely keep up. Around midnight, my gas light came on. I tried to push it, but the nearest gas station was miles away, and I could tell the car wasn't going to make it much farther. I wasn't thrilled about stopping at a random station in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't have much choice. Eventually, I saw the flickering lights of an old, rundown gas station. The kind you don't see much anymore. It had that faded neon sign that buzzed and a dimly lit parking lot. It looked like it hadn't been updated in years, but it had gas, so I pulled in. I parked by the pump, and as I got out of the car, I noticed that there was no one around. The station was empty, except for a flickering light coming from inside the store. The wind howled and the rain poured down, making everything feel even more isolated. I went to fill up, and the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced over at the door of the station's convenience store, and that's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the door, barely visible through the rain streaking down the windows. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at me. At first, I thought he was maybe the cashier, just hanging around in the warmth of the store. But something about the way he stood there, motionless, watching me, made me feel uncomfortable. I tried not to look directly at him, but I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't just a glance, but something more unsettling. It felt like he was studying me. I kept my head down and focused on pumping the gas, trying to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. I was almost done when I heard his voice, low and raspy. "Nice car," he said. "You drive this often?" I didn't know what to say. The tone of his voice was strange, like he was asking something more than just a simple question. I tried to ignore him, but then he spoke again, this time with more directness. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze. It was late, I was alone, and the storm outside made everything feel like it was in some kind of eerie vacuum. The more he spoke, the more uncomfortable I became. There was something wrong with this guy, something that didn't sit right. He was too calm, too focused on me. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through." I finished filling up the tank, and as I was putting the nozzle back, I glanced at the door again. The man was still standing there, watching me. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I had finished. I grabbed a receipt, trying to hurry, feeling the weight of his stare on my back. As I started to walk back to my car, he stepped outside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and I noticed he was still staring at me, as though he was waiting for something. He walked slowly toward me, but not in a threatening way. More like he was just observing, calculating. I froze when he stepped right in front of my car, blocking my way. I wasn't sure what to do. I could have honked my horn, maybe driven around him, but there was something in the way he stood there that made me second-guess every move. "Where you headed?" he asked, still in that same low voice. It wasn't casual. It wasn't friendly. It felt almost predatory. I gave him a quick, forced smile. "I'm just going home." He didn't move. He stood there, looking directly at me, almost like he was waiting for me to say something more. I shifted uncomfortably, my fingers gripping the steering wheel, but I couldn't back up without running him over. "That's a nice car," he repeated, like he was trying to start a conversation again. But something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't small talk. It felt like an interrogation. "Does it ever break down on you?" I glanced at the gas meter. The car was fine. Everything was fine. Why was he asking all these strange questions? I had an overwhelming urge to just drive off, but something in me told me not to provoke him. I didn't want to make him angry, and I didn't know how he would react. "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound confident. "Thanks." But he didn't move. He stood there for a moment longer, still watching me, before taking a step closer, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "You should wait for a tow." I blinked, not understanding. "What?" "You should wait for a tow," he repeated, now more forcefully, pointing toward the front of my car. "Car's not going anywhere." I was confused and a little scared. The car was fine, and there was no reason I couldn't leave. I looked around, hoping to see someone else, someone who could confirm that this guy was just a weird, harmless loner. But no one else was in sight. It was just him and me, and he wasn't moving. "I'm fine," I said again, my voice shaky now. "I don't need a tow." He didn't respond immediately, but I saw a strange look cross his face, almost like he wasn't going to let it go. He stepped aside a little, but I could still see that he was blocking the exit. He stood there for a few more moments, watching me, before finally backing up and turning around. "All right," he muttered, "but you should be careful out there. People like you shouldn't be out in storms like this." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, thankful he wasn't pressing any further. I quickly got in my car and started the engine, my hands still shaking from the encounter. I didn't look back as I drove off, but I felt his eyes on me the whole time. It wasn't until I was far down the road, with the gas station far behind me, that I felt a little bit of relief. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with that man, and I never want to be in a situation like that again. I still don't know if he was just a lonely guy or if he had something more sinister in mind, but I trust my gut, and my gut told me to get out of there as quickly as possible. This happened last fall, and it's something that still makes me uneasy every time I get behind the wheel at night. I was driving home from a work trip, and I remember the weather being awful, rain coming down in sheets and that kind of thick fog that clings to the roads. The drive was long, and it had already been a rough day. I was tired, just wanting to get home. The roads were mostly empty, and I kept my speed in check, just trying to stay focused. I noticed the car behind me not long after I left the highway. It was too close. It wasn't tailgating, but it was close enough that it felt strange. I'm not one to be paranoid, but something about it made me uncomfortable. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, the The car was right there, maybe a little too close, but not enough for me to be certain. Just close enough that it felt off. I kept driving, thinking it was just the rain, playing tricks on me. But then the car didn't back off. I could see its headlights reflected in my side mirrors, and it kept pace with me no matter how fast I went. I sped up a little, hoping that would get them to pass, but it didn't make a difference. It stayed right behind me, matching my every move. At first, I thought maybe it was a coincidence, maybe the driver was just going the same way. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that creeping sensation in my stomach, the kind you get when you just know something isn't right. I tried not to focus on it too much, telling myself I was being overly cautious, but it didn't help. The rain started coming down harder, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I decided to pull off the road and wait for the storm to pass. Maybe the other driver would keep going, and I could just head back out when the rain slowed down. I pulled into a small turnout, just off the main road, with no other cars in sight. I turned off my headlights, thinking it was a good time to sit tight and wait for the worst of the rain to pass. I sat there for a while, watching the rain pour down, listening to the sound of it hitting the roof of my car. It was strangely quiet. The other car had followed me into the turnout, stopping just behind my vehicle. I couldn't see the driver's face through the rain and fog, but I could see the lights of the car still on, shining faintly through the mist. I could tell they were still waiting. I was hoping they would just turn around and leave, but they didn't. Minutes passed, and I began to get that uneasy feeling again, the one that tells you something's wrong, but you don't know exactly what it is. My mind kept racing, wondering if the driver was waiting for me to leave, or if they were just as stuck as I was. Then, out of nowhere, the other car's engine turned off. I didn't know what to make of it at first. I assumed they were just waiting too. But then I saw something that sent a shiver down my spine. The driver's door opened. I froze. I couldn't see the person clearly through the rain, but I could tell they were walking toward my car. My heart started beating faster. I didn't know what to think. I knew the driver had to be close by. Maybe they needed help, or maybe they just wanted to pass the time while they waited out the storm, but something didn't sit right. The way they walked, so calmly, almost deliberately, like they knew exactly where I was. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The walk felt too long. My mind raced, but my body wouldn't move. I didn't want to look directly at them, but I couldn't help it. I kept my eyes fixed on the figure, watching as they got closer and closer. I could hear the faint squish of their boots in the mud, the rain falling harder now. Then, just as they were about to reach my window, I couldn't take it anymore. My gut was telling me something was very wrong, and I wasn't waiting to find out what. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped off, my tires screeching as I pulled back onto the road. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The car was behind me again. It hadn't taken long for them to start following me, but this time it was different. They didn't just follow, they accelerated. The headlights in my mirror grew larger, and I could hear the roar of their engine, louder than my own. I sped up, weaving through the rain-soaked roads, trying to lose them. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, just reacting. The other car was still there, staying right behind me, even as I pushed the speedometer higher. I felt like I was in a chase, like I was being hunted. The roads were slick, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep this up. I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. Every time I looked, the car was closer. It was relentless. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was in danger or if I was just overreacting. But I didn't want to find out the hard way. I had to get away. I decided to try a move I hoped would work. I took an exit off the highway, hoping the other driver wouldn't follow. The roads were narrow, and I was praying that if I took the exit, I could lose them in the twists and turns. I sped down the unfamiliar road, hoping for the best. I didn't look back until I had reached a more populated area. Only then did I see that the other car had finally stopped following me. I didn't know why they had backed off, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I kept driving for another hour, making sure the car behind me was nowhere in sight. When I finally got home, I didn't stop to think about what had happened. I just locked the doors and sat inside, staring at the walls, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I still don't know who that driver was or why they were following me. Maybe they were just a coincidence, a strange encounter in a storm. But I can't shake the feeling that it was something much worse. I've never been so sure that something wasn't right, and I trust my instincts more than I used to. Since that night, I've learned to be more cautious, and I'll never again let myself be so unaware on the road. I still don't know why I went there. I was just looking for somewhere to stop for the night, somewhere off the highway. It had been a long drive, and the rain was coming down in sheets, so I figured I could just find a place to rest, wait out the storm, and get back on the road in the morning. I saw the sign as I was driving, Pineview Motel, in big, faded letters. It wasn't much, but it seemed like it would do. The kind of place that's stuck in time, with creaky floors and a smell that you can't quite place but doesn't quite seem unpleasant. I pulled into the parking lot, and it was nearly empty except for a couple of cars scattered around. The rain was heavy, so the lot was slick, but I made my way to the door. The moment I walked in, I felt that cold, musty air, the kind that doesn't go away because the place is too old to have decent ventilation. Behind the counter stood a man, probably in his mid-40s or early 50s. He was tall and had dark hair with a few streaks of gray. His face was calm, too calm. He didn't seem unfriendly, but there was something a little off about him, something in the way he looked at me, almost like he was waiting for me. He didn't smile. He just said, "Rain's coming down pretty hard tonight. Can I help you?" I nodded, already tired and ready to get to my room. "Yeah, I just need a room for the night." He didn't ask for much. Just my name and ID, which I gave without thinking. I paid in cash, and he handed me the key without much conversation. I didn't really mind, just wanted to get in out of the storm. As he handed me the key, I noticed a small sign behind him that said, "No refunds after check-in." It seemed odd, but nothing about it made me stop to think. I thanked him, took the key, and made my way to the room. It was on the far end of the building, and I couldn't help but notice how quiet the place was. The lights flickered above me as I walked down the narrow corridor. The smell in the hallway was a mix of stale carpet and something damp, like the rain had gotten inside at some point. I finally got to the room. It wasn't anything fancy: bed, a small bathroom, a TV that looked like it was from the 90s, and a desk that hadn't seen any use in years. The walls were thin, and I could hear the rain hitting the roof above me, the sound almost drowning out everything else. I locked the door, placed my bags down, and tried to relax, but there was something nagging at me. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked out the window, hoping to see the storm pass, but all I could see was the rain, sheets of water falling in waves, covering everything in sight. The parking lot below was empty. I hadn't seen anyone else when I walked in, and the other rooms seemed dark, with the blinds drawn tight. I didn't think too much of it at first, but then I noticed him. The man. The motel owner. He was standing outside near the office, watching. I couldn't tell if he was looking at me or if it was just coincidence, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, completely still in the rain, his hands in his pockets. It didn't seem like he was waiting for anyone, but he didn't move. Not once. I felt my stomach tighten. I tried to ignore it and went back to watching the rain outside, but when I glanced back at him, he was still there, watching. I decided to go down to my car, maybe get something to drink, just to get away from that feeling for a moment. I grabbed my jacket and left the room, walking across the wet parking lot. As I reached my car, I saw the man again, but this time he wasn't by the office. He was standing near the edge of the lot, just watching me. I stopped walking, unsure of what to do. "Everything okay?" I called out to him, trying to break the tension. He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at me, his eyes cold, his face expressionless. Then, without moving, he nodded slowly. "Yes, just making sure everything's all right." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I didn't want to make a scene. I turned and headed back toward the door, trying to act normal, but I could feel his gaze following me. I went back to my room and locked the door again. I didn't feel safe, but I wasn't sure why. I tried to tell myself that it was just nerves, that I was overreacting, but something was definitely wrong. I decided to wait for the storm to die down, hoping to just get some rest and get out of there as soon as I could. About an hour later, I decided to try and leave. I had to make sure I didn't get stuck here any longer than I needed to. The rain had slowed down a little, so I grabbed my things and walked out the door, hoping to just get back on the road. But when I stepped outside, there he was again, the man. Standing at the edge of the parking lot, blocking my car's exit. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what he was doing or why, but it didn't feel like coincidence anymore. He was standing there, just watching me, like he was waiting for me to make a move. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm leaving. I need to go." He didn't move. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, just enough to stop me from getting to my car. He didn't seem aggressive, but there was something in the way he blocked my path, like he was trying to control the situation. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm but stern. "You can't leave just yet. Not with the storm like it is. You need to stay here until it passes." I froze, staring at him. Something in his tone felt wrong. It wasn't an offer of help, it was an order. "I'm fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've had enough rest. I'm leaving." He didn't answer, but I saw his eyes narrow slightly. "You're not leaving," he said, and the way he said it made my blood run cold. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. I took a step back, thinking about making a run for it, but my mind was racing. I didn't know what he would do. There were no other cars around. I couldn't see anyone else on the property. It felt like I was trapped, alone with this man. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I backed up toward the door of my room, not taking my eyes off him. I didn't want to run, didn't want to provoke him, but I couldn't stay there either. When I got back inside the room, I locked the door behind me and just stood there, listening. I didn't hear him moving anymore, but I wasn't sure if he was still out there, waiting. It felt like hours before I finally decided to leave. I couldn't stay another minute. When the rain slowed enough, I left without a word, got in my car, and didn't look back. I haven't gone near that place again. I don't even want to remember it, but I can't forget the feeling like something was wrong, like I was being watched. I don't know what his intentions were, but I never want to find out. I was looking forward to a quiet weekend away. My job had been stressful lately, and I needed some time to myself to just relax, away from the noise of the city. I found a small cabin tucked away in the woods about an hour from town. It was the kind of place you find on a rental site, a little rustic, off the beaten path. The weather forecast was calling for rain all weekend, which I actually didn't mind. There was something comforting about being stuck in a cabin while the storm raged outside. I arrived Friday evening, just as the rain started to pick up. The place was exactly what I expected, small, old, but cozy. It had that musty, earthy smell you get with places that haven't seen much air. I didn't think much of it. The first thing I did was get the fire going. I made myself a cup of tea, grabbed a book, and settled in for what I thought was going to be a nice, peaceful evening. As the night went on, the rain only got worse. It was pounding on the roof, the kind of heavy rain that makes you feel like the world is closing in around you. I could hear the wind whistling through the trees outside, and the cabin creaked a little, but that was normal. I tried to relax, but I kept hearing little noises. At first, it was just the wind and the rain, but then there were knocks. Soft knocks, 1, 2, 3. I told myself it was probably the wind, or maybe an animal outside. But it kept happening. Every so often, the knocks would come again, and they sounded like they were coming from inside the cabin. I stood up and looked around the room. The fire was crackling in the fireplace, casting shadows across the walls, and the place felt so empty. I wasn't scared exactly, but I felt uneasy. Like there was something in the air. Something wasn't right. I checked the windows, thinking maybe a branch was tapping against the glass, but they were all locked tight. I walked around the cabin, checking the doors, making sure everything was secure. It wasn't until I walked past the front door that I saw them. Boots. Not just any boots, but big, heavy work boots, sitting right by the door like they'd been left there intentionally. They were soaking wet, the soles covered in mud, and the laces were tangled. I froze. My first thought was maybe someone had been staying in the cabin before me and left them there, but that didn't make any sense. I had gotten the cabin on my own, and the place had been cleaned before I arrived. There was no way someone else had been here recently. I reached down and picked them up, just to see if there was any sign of who they belonged to, but there was nothing. No name tag, no identification of any kind. It was like they'd just been abandoned. I glanced around the room again, but the cabin was still empty. No one else was there. I set the boots back down and moved to the window. I looked out into the dark, wet night, but all I could see was the storm, the rain blurring everything outside. I didn't know what to make of the boots. Maybe someone else had been there, and I just missed them. Maybe the storm had caused some kind of misunderstanding, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. But then I heard it. A scraping sound. Soft at first, like fingernails running across a surface. It came from the hallway, just outside the living room where I was sitting. The noise was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze again, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was something else. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. I didn't want to check, but I had to. I couldn't just ignore it. I walked down the hallway, holding my breath, listening for any sign of movement. The scraping sound stopped as I reached the end of the hallway, and for a second, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then there was a knock. A real knock. Right at the door. 3 solid, loud knocks. Someone was outside. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to open the door, but I couldn't just leave it unanswered. I moved to the door and stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do. My mind raced. Maybe it was another person seeking shelter from the storm. Maybe it was a neighbor from the nearby cabin who needed help. But something didn't feel right. I slowly turned the doorknob, the door creaking as I opened it just a crack. The rain hit my face immediately, and I squinted through the downpour, looking for anyone standing outside. The driveway was empty. There was no one there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I felt their presence. My skin crawled. I stepped back from the door and closed it quickly, locking it behind me. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time, my heart racing, trying to make sense of everything. The storm outside was so loud, but inside, it was eerily quiet. I tried to tell myself it was just the weather, just the isolation playing tricks on me, but the boots, the knocks, the scraping, none of it made sense. I went back to the window and peered out, trying to see through the rain. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just outside, just beyond the range of the light. It was hard to make out clearly through the rain and the darkness, but I could tell that whoever it was, they were watching me. Standing completely still. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't know what I would tell them. There was no one on the road. No signs of anything wrong, except that feeling, the feeling of being watched. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, until I finally had to look away. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back from the window. My hands were shaking as I turned to the door again, the same door that I had locked just minutes before. The door handle was turning. Slowly. Quietly. I froze. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the door, hearing the faint click of the handle turning. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my heart pound in my chest. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was still beating against the cabin, but in that moment, all I could hear was the soft scrape of the handle. It stopped, and for a few seconds, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I just imagined the whole thing. But then the door creaked again, like something was pushing against it, testing it. I didn't wait around to find out. I grabbed my stuff, my keys, anything I could carry, and I bolted out the back door, not looking back. I didn't care if it was raining harder. I didn't care if I was soaking wet. I wasn't staying in that cabin another minute. I ran through the woods, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get away from whatever was in that cabin. The rain pounded against me, but I kept moving, not stopping until I found the main road. I didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was in there, or what they wanted, but I know I wasn't supposed to be there. I'll never forget the feeling of someone watching me, the noise, the scrape at the door. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear it. And every time I pass that area on a road trip, I take the long way around.